As soon as Xianxia said this, even she couldn't help but be slightly nervous. According to his limited knowledge, he was able to infer that the method to attain the Tao and become a god that these immortal kings risked their lives to come here and look for was hidden on the god attainment altar. Now, if the sovereign sect were to obtain it before them, then the consequences would be unimaginable. Ranfeng nodded and said, "That should be the case." When they obtained a definite answer, the hearts of Yu and the others couldn't help but sink, and they felt urgency in their hearts. "We can't wait any longer. Let's set out at once." Xianxia spoke frankly. "All right." Without giving it any further thought, Yu, Dian, and Heaven Trampler agreed successively. As for Shi, he had to follow by their sides regardless of whether he agreed or not. "Wait," Ranfeng hurriedly said when he saw this. "We were discussing joining forces to enter the God Attainment Palace together earlier. If all of you don't mind, then why don't you join us?" As soon as these words were spoken, it drew the agreement of the others. Yeah, the God Attainment Palace is densely covered in the restrictions of the gods, and it's vast like a maze. Moreover, it's filled with innumerable dangers. Only by working together and converging our strengths would we be able to deal with these dangers. This palace is the test to become a god, and it's filled with dangers. It can be said that we only have a slim chance of survival. Everyone, you must not act rashly. Why don't all of you act together with all of us? How about we set out after we discuss and form a superb strategy? Yu swept the others with his gaze upon hearing this, and then he shook his head and refused in the end. "There's no need. Compared to the dangers within the palace, I'm even more worried about the people by my side harboring ill intent." As soon as he finished speaking, he'd already led Xianxia, Dian, Heaven Trampler, and Shi to step into the door of the palace, and they vanished in an instant. What does he mean by that? Could it be that he suspects that we would harm him? Damn it! These heirs of Nuwas Dao Palace are truly arrogant. When they heard Yu's frank refusal, their faces sank, and they were extremely displeased. Only Ranfeng spoke calmly. He wasn't wrong. Even though we shouldn't have the intention to harm others, yet we have to be on guard against others. All of the others grunted coldly without end when they heard this. Obviously, they didn't agree with Ranfeng. However, it's good that they acted before us. It just happens that they can point out a path for us, and perhaps we can avoid a great deal of trouble by following closely behind them. Ranfeng suddenly changed the topic and laughed lightly. The others instantly came to an understanding when they heard this. Indeed, if we have Yu and the others to lead the way, then even if we encounter some dangers, we can use them as cannon fodder. One of them couldn't help but say, "Since it's like that, then let's set out quickly." Exactly. If we're a step slower, then I'm afraid that even if we enter the God Attainment Altar, the secret technique to become a god will be seized by the others. The others chimed in successively. Ranfeng immediately nodded when he heard this, and then he turned around and walked towards the palace. The others hurriedly followed up to him. Sun Wuhan walked at the very back, and he gazed at Ranfeng's back while seeming to be lost in thought. He said in his heart, "Why do I feel that this fellow seems to have been waiting for Heaven Trampler and the others to make an appearance?" After that, he shook his head and stopped thinking about it. The God Attainment Hall was filled with killing intent, so he couldn't let his thoughts run wild. When Shi and the others entered the God Attainment Palace, a wisp of dazzling and resplendent light pierced their eyes, and when Shi saw the scene before his eyes, he was extremely shocked in his heart. There was actually a large world within the God Attainment Palace. This world had mountains, lakes, a sun, a moon, stars, living beings. At this moment, they were standing in an expanse of space, and they were looking down at this boundless world. They were able to clearly see that there was a long limestone path at the center of the world, and it started from right beneath their feet and extended boundlessly into the distance. Grand Tao Foundation Stone. Sure, you recognized this path, and his expression was completely solemn. "Everyone, you must be careful. Once we step foot on this path, then we have to face numerous dangers and killing intent. We absolutely can't be careless and negligent at all." Everyone felt their hearts shudder, and they withdrew the strongest immortal artifacts in their possession. The 5-color rock glowed with a multicolored light, and it carried all of them to arrive at the limestone path that was called Grand Tao Foundation Stone. As soon as he stepped foot on it, Xianxia's pupils instantly constricted slightly while his gaze was drawn by a part of the limestone path. There was a footprint there, and it was deeply imprinted onto the limestone path. It looked to be ordinary, yet when Xianxia's gaze swept over, he clearly sensed a terrifying aura that was sharp and murderous like a blade, and it effused out from within the footprint. What sort of person would actually be able to imprint their footprint within this God Attainment Palace and allow it to remain after experiencing the passage of countless years? Unfortunately, Xianxia was unable to guess the identity of this person. This implied meaning behind this footprint wasn't a proof of strength, and it represented that an immortal king had instantly perished here upon taking his first step into the God Attainment Palace. Yu and the others were naturally clearly aware of this, so when they saw that footprint, their expressions were already heavy to the extreme. The vital energy in their entire bodies rumbled while they circulated it with all their strength, and they didn't dare be careless in the slightest step. Yu took a deep breath while a wisp of a resolute and murderous expression flashed in the space between his brows. He utilized the 5-color rock to cover all of them as they took a step forward in unison. Bang! Xianxia felt his mind suddenly rumble before the heavens and the earth around him revolved while his field of vision spun, and then a terrifying and enormous bang resounded, causing his mind to feel dazed. When his vision recovered once more, Xianxia was instantly astounded, because he noticed to his surprise that he'd actually appeared on an ancient battlefield. Blood was flowing everywhere while bones piled up on the ground, and the smoke of war shot into the sky. On the battlefield, there were numerous tall figures in bronze armor and holding various weapons. The entire bodies of these tall figures emanated a blood-red divine radiance, and they'd encircled their group. These figures simply seemed to have covered the heavens and the earth. Everywhere that met the eyes was a dense mass of these tall figures, and they filled every single corner of this ancient battlefield. They possessed monstrous auras, and they emanated extremely fierce killing intent that caused one's heart to palpitate. In Xianxia's opinion, every single figure in bronze armor had an aura that actually wasn't inferior to an existence at the half-step Immortal King realm. Besides that, at the center of the ancient battlefield was a terrifying towering figure that was an entire 30 kilometers tall. This figure's aura was deep like an abyss. His blood-red hair hung loosely down like a waterfall, and he wore a blood-colored cape. His eyes were like 2 lakes, and he was looking at them with an icy cold gaze. His gaze was extremely terrifying, and it seemed like merely a single gaze was capable of obliterating the soul of a peerless expert. He was absolutely in existence at the Immortal King realm, and he was the type of Immortal King that possessed an extremely terrifying strength. Because Xianxia noticed that when they saw this tall figure with blood-red hair, the expressions of Yu and the others changed slightly and became rather unsightly. However, because he had Yu and the others defending him, Xianxia didn't feel any terrifying oppressive aura from this tall figure, and it allowed him to clearly witness everything before his eyes. Otherwise, if he'd come here by himself, then he would have probably been instantly crushed by the terrifying imposing aura of this ancient battlefield. The perfection stage of the Immortal King realm. He's only a sliver away from touching the God rank realm. There are 100,000 half-step Immortal King realm bronze combat troops. This is probably the God Attainment Palace's Combat King restriction, and it's a supreme divine restriction. We must annihilate that Combat King that's in command in this ancient battlefield within the time for an incense stick to burn in order to pass through this restriction. But it's strange. Isn't the aura of this Combat King too terrifying? This is only the first restriction of the God Attainment Palace. There's a pattern to the changes of the Combat King restriction. If I'm not wrong, the Combat King encountered by the Sovereign Sex group was probably the weakest in the Immortal King realm. Yet when it's our turn, it was transformed into the strongest Combat King. No wonder that old monkey and the others didn't enter this palace for so long. So, it turns out that they were waiting for us to take the lead, and then the combat king they encountered after us would be the weakest once more. They really know how to take advantage. There's no time to think about all of that now. We must kill that combat king within the time for an incense stick to burn. Otherwise, we won't be able to leave this divine restriction anymore. In an instant, Yu and the others had conversed via their thoughts, and their expressions were covered in a wisp of killing intent. Kill! Yu held the 5-color rock in his left hand while holding the God Mystery Sword in his right, and he led all of them to swiftly charge out. He slashed out with a terrifying sword light that instantly killed over 100 bronze combat troops. At the same time, Xianxia Li, Dian Dian, and Heaven Trampler attacked as well, and they joined forced with Yu to charge forward through the enemy ranks. For a time, severed limbs shot into the surroundings while blood filled the sky. At the instant Yu and the others attacked, the entire vast ancient battlefield seemed as if it had come to life, and then the sounds of drums, roars, and battle cries resounded and shook the heavens. The smoke of war raged while the dense mass of bronze combat troops surged over from all directions. At the center of the ancient battlefield, the combat king stood there without moving, and he looked over with an icy cold and indifferent gaze. He was like a king that was commanding his powerful army and commanding the battlefield. Kill! 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 At this moment, Yu and the others didn't hold back at all. Divine radiance erupted from their entire bodies, and it was filled with a supreme divine might. Every single time they attacked, it would definitely reap the lives of over 1,000 bronze combat troops, and they killed to the point blood flowed into rivers, the ground was completely scarlet red, and the sky dimmed down. These were bronze combat troops that were comparable to the half-step Immortal King realm. Yet, an Immortal King was actually able to annihilate over 1,000 of these bronze combat troops with a wave of the hand. This scene flabbergasted Xianxia, and he finally completely understood the gap between the Immortal King realm and half-step Immortal King realm. It was simply like the difference between the heavens and the earth. One was high above while the other low on the ground, and they couldn't be compared at all. Of course, no matter how weak these bronze combat troops were, killing a golden immortal like Xianxia was as easy as killing an ant. This was the gap in their cultivation realms, and it was impossible to surmount. Because Yu and the others were charging through the enemy ranks and coupled with the protection of the 5-color rock, Xianxia didn't encounter any danger, yet he was similarly unable to be of any help as well. At this moment, he could only watch everything that was occurring before him, and he was powerless to do anything. This caused Xianxia to be unable to help but feel depressed, and he couldn't help but arouse a feeling of doubt. Why would senior sister Li Yang arrange for me to take part in this? From the beginning until the end, I've been no different from a burden, so exactly what's the point of this? Xianxia was completely unaware that the river diagram fragments in his sea of consciousness seemed as if it had noticed something at this moment, and it awakened once more from silence before it emanated a trace of an imperceptible fluctuation. Corpses piled into mountains while blood rained down like waterfalls. Under Yu's lead, all of them charged straight towards the combat king that stood at the center of the battlefield. However, because there were too many bronze combat troops that formed a dense ocean while charging towards them fearlessly, it greatly obstructed their footsteps forward. When looked at from afar, their group was like a lone boat that was charging through an ocean of enemies, and it was utterly impossible for them to quickly approach the combat king that stood at the center of the battlefield. We don't have much time left. Kill! After a short moment, Yu roared towards the sky with a voice that sounded like thunder, and it resounded throughout the surroundings. As he spoke, the God Mystery Sword in his hand tore through the air, and it transformed into a boundless rain of swords that swept out and instantly slaughtered over 1,000 bronze combat troops. They had to kill the combat king in the time for an incense stick to burn, otherwise it would be impossible for them to leave this divine restriction, and that meant that their group would perish here. So at this moment, none of them dared to slack off, and they executed their strongest attacks. Swish! 9 clarity divine light shot into the sky like a rainbow and flowed towards the surroundings. It was like 9 divine dragons soaring through the ancient battlefield, and it carried along a string of bloody waves with it. Hiss! Hiss! The Emperor Divine Battle Axe transformed into violent crescents that filled the sky, and it shot explosively towards the surroundings like sharp blades. Everywhere it passed, a horrifying blood-red rift was slashed upon amongst the surging horde of enemies. Rumble. Compared to Shangliu Li and Dian Dian's attacks, Heaven Trampler's actions were even more direct. He held the dark and enormous axe as he chopped down successively. Every single chop of the axe definitely shook the heavens and the earth, and it caused countless pieces of flesh to spray into the air while pillars of blood shot into the sky. This battle was extremely intense. The four immortal kings were making every second count and utilizing all the ability they possessed. Because this was a restriction of the gods within the God Attainment Palace, and if they were unable to pass through it, then their fate would be instantly decided. At that time, not to mention the method to become a god, even their lives would be left behind here. How could Shi Yu and the others dare be careless under such circumstances? It was precisely because they were concentrating that they completely didn't notice that Chen Shi, who was being protected at their center, was in a strange state at this moment. OM. 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 Within his sea of consciousness, the river diagram fragments were shaking and howling lightly, and they emanated strands of strange energy fluctuations that completely enveloped Chen Shi and seeped into his soul. All of this happened too suddenly, and it caused even Chen Shi to be unaware why the river diagram fragments would suddenly awaken once more in this ancient battlefield that was filled with killing intent. Moreover, the movement of the river diagram fragments this time was so intense. Bang! Before Chen Shi could recover from his shock, he felt a thunderclap resound within his mind, and then the scene before his eyes seemed as if it had been blasted into pieces, causing even his soul to tremble. When he returned once more to his senses, he suddenly noticed that everything in his field of vision had changed. The dense mass of bronze combat troops had actually transformed into numerous strange and dense talismans, and they were twisting about like tadpoles. The heavens, earth, and space within the ancient battlefield had transformed into obscure patterns that were formed from numerous distorted and mysterious talismans. It was even to the extent that the towering combat king that stood at the center of the battlefield had transformed into an extremely mysterious and terrifying talisman marking. Yes, at this moment, within Chen Shi's field of vision, everything in the ancient battlefield had transformed into talismans. He'd once seen these talismans on the entrance to the God Attainment Palace, and they were obscure, mysterious, and twisted about like tadpoles. Moreover, they seemed like the language of the gods. However, at this moment these talismans were moving, and they transformed into the bronze combat troops, the heavens and the earth here, and the combat king that stood in the distance and emanated boundless killing intent. This is the true appearance of the combat king restriction. A flash of inspiration appeared in Chen Shi's mind, and he understood everything. However, in next to no time, Chen Shi couldn't be bothered about all of this, because he suddenly noticed that even though the bronze combat troops that covered the heavens and the earth and were made from mysterious talismans were being utterly crushed by Shi Yu and the others to the point a rain of blood sprayed through the sky, they didn't really die. It was even to the extent that it didn't take long before the pieces of their flesh and the rain of blood would condense into form once more, and then they would charge over courageously once again. Of course, in Chen Shi's eyes, it was damaged, mysterious talismans that were being combined together once more. What did this mean? It meant that the bronze combat troops on this ancient battlefield couldn't be wiped out at all. In his sea of consciousness, the river diagram fragments were still droning and trembling, and they reminded Chen Shi that all of this hadn't ended. Amidst the strange state, all the mysterious and obscure talismans in Chen Shi's field of vision grew clearer and clearer, and it was even to the extent that he was able to identify how the smallest talisman markings within the talismans circulated. So that's the most basic circulation pathway of the Grand Tao of the five elements. Wind and lightning, yin and yang, star. In next to no time, various comprehensions surged into Chen Shi's heart, and he recognized the energy of the Grand Tao that he was familiar with from within the dense talismans that covered the sky. However, at this moment, these familiar Grand Taos had transformed into mysterious, distorted, and obscure talismans, and the pathways that the talisman markings of these talismans circulated with were the most intrinsic characteristic of these various Grand Taos. For example, the Grand Tao of Fire's quintessence pathway seemed to be lively and unrestrained. It wasn't a fixed pathway, and it would instead evolve like water, grow like wood, seemed condensed and heavy like the earth. Every single one of the other Grand Daos were like this as well. As his comprehensions grew deeper, Xianxia finally dared to confirm that these mysterious and obscure talismans were formed from the true quintessence energy of the Grand Dao. They weren't Dao insights or laws or all-heaven divine crests. It was the true energy of the Grand Dao. It had returned to its source and was displayed in the form of talismans. Xianxia faintly captured a type of enlightenment. It was a type of enlightenment related to fusing the Dao for the Saint Immortal realm. If one wanted to advance into the Saint Immortal realm, one had to completely fuse all the various golden immortal laws that one possessed before establishing a Saint Dao law of one's own. This was the fusing of the Dao. Earlier, even though Xianxia was clearly aware of this, he wasn't able to figure out exactly what he should do because he was only at the perfection stage of the golden immortal realm, and he wasn't a Saint Immortal. Yet now, the mysterious talismans before his eyes that were formed from the quintessence of various Grand Dao seemed to have completely fused various Grand Daos into the talisman Grand Dao. It felt like everything within this ancient battlefield had displayed a lifelike process of fusing the Dao to him. The fluctuations of the river diagram fragments in his sea of consciousness grew in intensely. If it was said to be like a surging river earlier, then it was like tempestuous waves in an ocean at this moment. Before Xianxia could comprehend even more profundities, the scene before his eyes rumbled and changed once more. This time, Xianxia noticed to his shock that all the talismans in his field of vision actually contained a strand of the aura of divinity. And even the circulation pathways of the talismans were filled with an indescribably wonderful rhythm. What's this? Xianxia was puzzled and dazed. This force was too terrifying, and it seemed to be supreme and paramount. It wasn't something that he could come into contact with at all. Perhaps this is the true restriction of the gods, and it's filled with the laws of gods. Swish! Swish! After that, Xianxia noticed to his shock that the talismans that covered the sky actually seemed to have been pulled by a shapeless force and ceaselessly swarmed towards him. Yet the four immortal kings by his side actually didn't notice all of this at all. What's going on? Xianxia was astounded. Those talismans formed the bronze combat troops, yet they're charging towards me now. What if they kill me? However, what happened next proved that Xianxia's worries were unnecessary. When the first talisman charged into his body, it didn't cause any damage to him, and it instead transformed into an indescribably warm flow that spread throughout his body. After that, Xianxia suddenly sensed that the energy of the Grand Dao of Fire he possessed actually faintly improved a tiny bit. Swish! Before Xianxia could figure out all of this, strands of talismans surged into Xianxia's body like tidewater, and they surged in ceaselessly as if there was no end to them. During this entire process, Xianxia didn't feel any discomfort at all. Conversely, all of this was like a warm current that swiftly improved Xianxia's grasp of the various Grand Daos. In practically an instant, his grasp towards the Grand Dao laws of creation, eternal, and devour had actually been condensed into a completely new all-heaven divine crest, the enduring divine crest. It contained boundless forms and was capable of devouring the heavens and the earth. Thus it was eternally enduring and was called enduring. All of this occurred so suddenly and swiftly, and it caused Xianxia to lack the time to figure out why exactly this had happened. After that, all of this had already occurred, so it naturally caused Xianxia to be unable to help but feel shocked and even dazed. Fortunately, he was clearly aware that this was caused by the sudden awakening of the river diagram fragments. Otherwise he would truly doubt the state of his mind and wonder if his heart had been invaded by inner demons, causing him to hallucinate. This wasn't the end of it. In the subsequent period of time, along with the ceaseless surging of talismans into his body, Xianxia grasped the Tai Chi divine crest that was condensed from the Grand Dao laws of light, darkness, yin, and yang. Then it was the rise-fall divine crest condensed from the Grand Dao laws of Paramitha and oblivion. Next, at this point, all the Grand Dao laws Xianxia possessed had been completely condensed into all-heaven divine crests, and they were respectively the five-element divine crest, tempest divine crest, star obliteration divine crest, Tai Chi divine crest, rise-fall divine crest, and spatial divine crest. Wait, why has this combat king's strength weakened? Perhaps he was putting on an empty show of strength earlier. Perhaps. Who cares? Let's kill him first. Suddenly, a wave of clamorous noise resounded, and it jolted Xianxia awake. Before Xianxia could see the situation before him clearly, a wave of terrifying rumbling of battle swept over. After a short moment, "We've succeeded. This combat king restriction isn't really great. Don't get happy too early. This is only the first step in the God Attainment Palace, and there are even more terrifying restrictions waiting for us." Xianxia, what's wrong with you? When Xianxi's field of vision cleared up, he instantly noticed that he'd already escaped the ancient battlefield and returned to the limestone path that seemed to be boundlessly long. At this side, Yu and the others were looking at him with puzzled expressions. Xianxia completely returned to his senses when he saw this, and he shook his head as he said, "I'm fine. The battle just now was too formidable, so I couldn't help but be slightly affected. I've recovered now." Yu and the others came to a sudden understanding when they heard this. At the same time, along with the departure of Yu and the others, the ancient battlefield within the Combat King restriction had returned once more to deathly silence. However, above the sky that was covered in roiling black clouds, a deep, icy cold, and indifferent eye opened up, and then it vanished almost instantaneously. Grand Tao Foundation Stone. This was the name Yu and the others called the limestone path before them. According to legend, there were 36 restrictions of the gods set up on this limestone path, and every single restriction contained different killing intent and dangers that were extremely difficult to surmount. Since the prehistoric times until now, countless immortal kings had stepped foot on this path, yet merely a small portion of them passed through this limestone path, whereas the rest perished on it. They either fell into the restrictions and were trapped alive within them, or they were directly crushed by the restrictions. However, no matter how dangerous this place was, it still couldn't stop the immortal kings from stepping foot into this place because the God Attainment Altar was at the end of this limestone path. The secrets to attaining the Tao and becoming a god was hidden on the God Attainment Altar. Xianxia wasn't aware of all of this. At this moment, countless questions arose in his heart as he looked at the limestone path. Everything he experienced within the Combat King restriction earlier was too unbelievable. The river diagram fragments had emanated a fluctuation that didn't just allow him to view the true appearance of the Combat King restriction. He even obtained extraordinarily great benefits. In a short period of less than 10 minutes, he'd actually successfully condensed the Enduring Divine Crest, the Tai Chi Divine Crest, and the Rise-Fall Divine Crest. Moreover, every single one of them was an extremely rare and supreme divine crest. For example, the Enduring Divine Crest contained the rare Grand Tao profundities of Eternal, Creation, and Devour. For example, the Tai Chi Divine Crest contained the Grand Tao laws of light, darkness, yin, and yang. If it was said that Xianxia was barely able to stay sane when facing these two all-heaven divine crests, then the Rise-Fall Divine Crest truly shocked him greatly. After all, this divine crest was condensed into form from the supreme Grand Tao laws of the Netherworld, the Grand Taos of Paramitha and Oblivion, and it was related to the profundities of rebirth. Originally, Xianxia hadn't intended to utilize these two Grand Tao laws at all. Yet never had he imagined that he would condense them successfully by coincidence. The only thing that made Xianxia feel at ease was that he hadn't comprehended the Grand Tao of Terminus. Otherwise, once it was condensed, then it would definitely emanate the aura of samsara. That was a great taboo, and once it was condensed successfully, then the consequences would be unimaginable. Besides that, the energy of the talismans in the Combat King restriction shocked Xianxia as well, and they allowed Xianxia to see through and comprehend the method of fusing the Tao that only Saint Immortals could comprehend. Xianxia was very confident that when he advanced into the Saint Immortal realm, he would absolutely be able to smoothly fuse the Tao by relying on the comprehensions he obtained here, allowing him to establish a Saint Tao law of his own. All of this came from the river diagram fragments. This caused Xianxia to have an even better understanding that the river diagram fragments were definitely greatly related to the God Attainment region. Otherwise, it would absolutely impossible for the river diagram fragments to awaken successively and take him by surprise. Strange, wasn't that Combat King a little too easy to kill? I originally thought that even if the four of us joined forces, it would be impossible to finish him in a short period of time. Yet never had I imagined that when we truly made a move against him, it was as easy as blowing off dust. Heaven Trampler spoke with a rumbling voice, and he was still unable to figure it out. Is it bad that the Combat King was extremely weak? Dian Dian couldn't help but roll her eyes. Actually, she felt it was slightly strange as well. Earlier, when they killed the Combat King in the ancient battlefield, it was too easy indeed. It was as if the Combat King's strength had been completely extracted, and he existed merely in appearance. Chun, she thought in his heart when he heard this. Since everything within that ancient battlefield was formed from the restrictions of the gods, then the Combat King is naturally no exception. So, could the talismans that surged into my body because of the river diagram fragments have imperceptibly weakened that Combat King's strength? He was unable to confirm his suspicions, yet he faintly felt that it was probably the truth. All right, let's make the best use of our time and continue forward. Sure, you spoke while his expression had become solemn. He covered all of them with the 5-color rock before taking another step on the limestone path. It seemed like a simple step, yet it actually passed through layer upon layer of space, and the heavens and the earth instantly changed intensely once more. Raging winds howled furiously while tempestuous waves surged. Rumble. Wave after wave of extremely rancid seawater transformed into tempestuous waves that slapped over without end. This was a boundless sea. Bone-piercingly cold winds blew through the surface of the black-colored sea, and Chen, she could faintly see that dark red-colored blood that was filled with the dense stench of blood was surging within the seawater. As soon as Shi Yu and the others appeared here, a wave of beast roars that shook the heavens instantly erupted from the distant surface of the sea, and it was like a roaring thunderclap that reverberated through the surroundings. Numerous 9-headed snakes that were lofty like mountains charged out from the sea. Their bodies were like floating masses of land that twisted and wound about while floating up and down on the surface of the sea. Moreover, their entire bodies were suffused with a terrifying and bloody baleful aura. Besides that, at the utmost back of the group of 9-headed snakes was a figure that was an entire 300 m tall and emanated an extremely terrifying and monstrous imposing aura. His skin was dark green and covered in scales, and he had an extremely enormous snake head with blood-red eyes that illuminated the heavens and the earth like lanterns. The Shaman Python Restriction. 9-headed snakes. The Grand Fiend God Shaman Python. In an instant, the expressions of Shi Yu and the others became extremely heavy. They naturally recognized the 9-headed snakes as primeval variant beasts that innately grasped the energy of 9 Grand Tao. Moreover, they controlled the energy of wind, lightning, water, and electricity, and they possessed almost monstrous divine abilities. Presently, even though the 9-headed snakes that appeared before them merely possessed strengths at the half-step Immortal King realm, they were much more difficult to kill than the bronze combat troops in the Combat King restriction. Especially the Grand Fiend God Shaman Python, he was a variant amongst fiend gods from the beginning of the world when the chaos was split apart, and he was called the spirit of the ancestral shaman. Even though he was a variant, even the primeval gods were afraid of his strength. Damn it! When did the restrictions of the gods in this god attainment palace become so abnormal? Why would it be in existence like the Grand Fiend God Shaman Python? This is only the second restriction of the gods. Heaven Trampler cursed with an unsightly expression. It really shouldn't appear here. According to the examples of the past, only the descendant of the Grand Fiend God Shaman Python would appear in the Shaman Python restriction. Xiangliu Li's expression became slightly unsightly as well. I'm worried that if it continues according to this sort of circumstances, then the restrictions of the gods will only become more and more terrifying, and will probably only be able to pass through a few before. Dian Dian spoke with a heavy expression, and she couldn't bear to finish her sentence. However, everyone understood what she meant. Indeed, this was only the second restriction of the gods, yet the Grand Fiend God Shaman Python had appeared. Then what about the restrictions after this? What would they do if existences that were even more terrifying than the Grand Fiend God Shaman Python appeared? No matter what, let's kill our way over there first. Even though the time restriction for this second restriction is double that of the first restriction, We don't know how long it'll take to kill that grand fiend god shaman python. Sure Yu took a deep breath and restrained the surprise and bewilderment in his heart, and the space between his brows was filled with a murderous expression. That's the only thing we can do. Move out. The others weren't irresolute and hesitant people as well, and they immediately made their decisions. Bang! Bang! Sure Yu led all of them to swiftly charge towards the distance. For a time, the entire black-colored sea was once again filled with boundless divine radiance, while various immortal artifacts soared through the sky, and they emanated terrifying fluctuations that shook the heavens. From the beginning until the end, no one noticed that as soon as he stepped foot into the shaman python restriction, Xianxia had once again fallen into that strange state from before. The river diagram fragments were droning. The 9-headed snakes, the grand fiend god shaman python, the heavens, the earth, the sea, the entire world before his eyes had transformed into various obscure and mysterious talismans. However, this time, the scenes of fusing the Tao didn't appear before Xianxia's field of vision, and it directly created a force that started to devour the talismans that surged over from all directions. The river diagram fragments droned without end, and the talismans that surged into Xianxia's body grew in number. It wasn't long before he noticed that his grasp towards the 5-element divine crest had attained perfection, and it was impossible to improve any longer. This meant that he'd already attained the most perfect grasp of the energy of the grand Tao contained within the 5-element divine crest. All of this seemed to be simple, yet there were actually too many transformations that occurred in this extremely short period of time, and the speed of these transformations even caused Xianxia to have no time to understand it in detail. Everything occurred just like it had in the Combat King restriction. It was like an unbelievable dream that caused Xianxia to have no choice but to believe it, and he stood stunned on the spot as if he'd been possessed. Couldn't be helped, the transformation came too quickly, and he didn't even have the chance to be surprised or feel pleasantly surprised. At the instant that Xianxia attained perfection in his grasp of the 5-element divine crest, a wave of surprised and bewildered voices resounded by his ears. What happened? Weak. Truly too weak. Less than 10 minutes have passed. Yet this shaman python restriction seems to have weakened too greatly. Ha ha ha. Fucking trash that looks imposing but is worthless. You made me fucking worry for no reason. Along with this voices of conversation, Xianxia instantly returned to his senses. He raised his eyes to look over and noticed that he'd actually left the shaman python restriction and had returned once more to the limestone path. Everything happened too quickly. From the beginning until the end, not even 10 minutes had passed. Up until now, Sure Yu and the others still didn't dare believe that they'd actually annihilated the grand fiend god shaman python so easily and easily passed through the second restriction of the gods. Exactly what's going on? Sure Yu and the others didn't hurry to move forward once more, and they started to ponder carefully instead, because this matter was too strange, and it caused them to faintly have a slightly anxious feeling in their hearts. Only Xianxia was clearly aware that all of this was the contribution of the river diagram fragments, whereas he'd obtained extraordinary benefits from it. However, he didn't know how to explain it to all of them. Could it be that I should say that the shaman python restriction weakened because I'm in existence at the golden immortal realm? If I really speak these words, then they'd definitely think I'm an idiot. So at this moment, Xianxia could only act indifferent and silently reap the benefits. At the same time, Suirenting and Jiang Lingxiao walked out of the 34th restriction of the gods. Both their figures were in a slightly sorry state, and their countenances were slightly pale. Obviously, they'd just experienced an extremely difficult battle. However, when they walked out of the restriction, both of them heaved long sighs of relief while a wisp of a relaxed expression appeared on their faces. Junior Sister Jiang, make every second count and recover your strength. We only have to pass through 2 more restrictions before we'll be the first to arrive before the God Attainment Altar. At that time, the secret technique to attain the Tao and become a god will be ours. Suirenting turned around and looked at the end of the limestone path from afar, and then a wisp of coldness suffused the corners of his mouth. As for the others, it's probably impossible for them to leave the God Attainment region with their lives this time. Jiang Lingxiao was clearly aware of Suirenting's plan. Earlier, every time they passed through a restriction of the gods after they entered the God Attainment Palace, they would utilize a type of calamity secret technique of the sovereign sect and smeared sacrificial blood to completely activate the might of the restrictions they'd just passed through. Up until now, they'd passed the 34th restriction, and they'd paid a price of 34 divine artifacts. Even though the sovereign sect had a long-standing foundation and didn't lack a few divine artifacts, sacrificing so many at one go still caused Zhang Lingxiao to feel pain from the loss. Divine artifacts were existences that exceeded the scope of void-grade immortal artifacts. Is paying such a hefty price worth it? Zhang Lingxiao couldn't help but ask while she meditated and recovered her strength. So long as we're able to completely annihilate the competition, then this price is nothing, right? Xuerenting said indifferently. Not to mention that these divine artifacts were mostly obtained from those members of the prehistoric sects that perished along the way. Even if we waste all of them, it couldn't be considered to be a loss at all. Zhang Lingxiao was stunned, and then went silent. Xuerenting seemed to have thought of something instead and said, "How long have we spent since the first restriction until now?" "Almost 16 hours. Zhang Lingxiao pondered for a moment before she answered. "It's slightly slow." Xuerenting frowned slightly. All those years ago when our sect master arrived here, he'd only utilized 12 hours of time. Zhang Lingxiao was stunned, and then she smiled while she thought in her heart. Comparing ourselves with the sect master from all those years ago? You're obviously looking to make a fool of yourself. Perhaps, when we obtain the method to become a god and break through from the immortal king realm, it will be sufficient for us to pursue the footsteps of the sect master. Xuerenting didn't notice the indifference in Zhang Lingxiao's expression, and as he finished speaking, his expression even faintly revealed a trace of fervor. The master of the sovereign sect. That was a supreme existence that had changed his entire life. Rumble. The combat king restriction was broken open, and numerous figures that were in a sorry state surged out from within. Damn it! What's going on? When did the combat king restriction become so formidable? According to the pattern of the past, after those fellows from Nuwas Dao Palace experienced the assault of the strongest combat king, the obstruction we encounter should have been the weakest. Yet now we actually lost 2 of our members. Iranfeng was in a sorry state. His countenance was pale while he revealed an extremely unsightly expression, and the space between his brows still carried a wisp of terror. At his side, Sun Wuhan and the others had similar expression, and they seemed like survivors of a disaster. Originally, they thought that if they followed behind the group from Nuwas Dao Palace and entered the God Attainment Palace, then the might of the restrictions of the gods that they encountered would definitely become weak. Never had they imagined that they would actually lose 2 of their companions in the first restriction. When they recalled the scene at that time, even if they were existences at the immortal king realm, coldness still couldn't help but emerge from their hearts because the strength of that combat king was simply too terrifying. Presently, there was only 4 of them left, including Iranfeng and Sun Wuhan. Yet, at this moment, they'd only passed the first of the 36 restrictions in the God Attainment Palace. Why don't we turn back? The restrictions of the gods seem to have undergone some sort of unexpected change this time. The odds aren't in our favor. One of them couldn't help but speak in a low voice and felt like withdrawing. Perhaps the second restriction, the Shaman Python restriction, wouldn't possess such a formidable might. I suggest we give it another try. One of them wasn't willing to return just like this instead. In the end, it was Iranfeng who made the decision for all of them to give it another try. If the might of the Shaman Python restriction was still formidable as the first restriction, then they would directly withdraw themselves from this vie for the secrets to become a god. After all, compared to the secret to become a god, they cared more about their own lives. If they didn't even have their lives, then how could they seek to become gods? On the long limestone path that seemed boundless, Shiryu and the others racked their heads yet were unable to figure it out, and they could only attribute all of this to luck. They didn't dare stay here any longer and immediately headed into the third restriction under Shiryu's lead. Swish! The heavens and the earth were overturned as the scene before their eyes instantly changed once more. Their group appeared within a deep abyss that was completely pitch black and enveloped by black mist. Even if it was Shiryu and the others, They were actually only able to sense an area of less than 500 kilometers in the surroundings. Swoosh! A sharp divine arrow tore through the sky and tore apart the black mist. It was like a dazzling flowing light that carried an extremely terrifying force as it shot over like a bolt of lightning. Its speed was too swift. It was swift to the point she had just opened his eyes and didn't have the time to react at all. After that, he heard an enormous bang rumble by his ear, and it shook his to the point he was dazed while his vital blood roiled without end. Sundrop Abyss. The Grand Sagittarius Restriction. Watch out! The expression of Shiryu and the others instantly turned grim. Even though that attack from before had been obstructed by Shiryu, the terrifying impact of that divine arrow shook his arm to the point it became slightly numb. Rumble. Suddenly, Xianxia activated the 9 Clarity Jade Crown, causing 9 Clarity Divine Light to sweep towards the surroundings. It completely dispelled the black mist that enveloped the boundless abyss, revealing an empty space that was around 500,000 kilometers in diameter. After that, everyone clearly noticed that numerous figures that wore robes made of skin and were branded with all sorts of ancient totem tattoos were actually standing in the surroundings. All of them held divine bows in their hands and possessed ferocious, imposing auras. They were like numerous divine archers, and they gave others the terrifying feeling of being targeted by a hunter. Descendants of the Grand Sagittarius. Everywhere that met the eye, countless divine archers like these were standing in the boundless abyss. Especially within the dense black mist at the bottom of the deep abyss, there was even an extremely terrifying aura effusing out from there. Obviously, a terrifying existence with monstrous strength was hidden there. Merely the first attack was strenuous for me to block. It's probably not easy to annihilate that Grand Sagittarius fiend, God in the time for 3 incense sticks to burn. Shiryu frowned, yet didn't act rashly because the attack from before caused his mood to suddenly become heavy. It has become strong indeed, and I feel like a chill is running up my spine. It feels like I'm the prey, and I've been completely locked onto by a group of hunters. Xianxia's beautiful brows knit together tightly. Since we've come here, then let's kill to our heart's content. How can we be indecisive and hesitant? Heaven Trampler grunted coldly. Have all of you noticed? All the energy in the surroundings is weakening at a shocking speed. Suddenly, Dian, who'd remained silent earlier, suddenly exclaimed with shock. Before her voice could finish resounding through the air, the others acutely noticed this sort of change, and all of them couldn't help but be slightly stunned. It's weakening again? Earlier, when they were in the Combat King restriction, they originally thought that an arduous battle couldn't be avoided in order to kill the Combat King, yet he fell with a single strike in the end. In the Shaman Python restriction, they'd even crushed the Grand Fiend God Shaman Python in less than 10 minutes of time. Now, they'd just stepped foot into the Grand Sagittarius restriction and hadn't even started a violent battle when the strength of their opponents was actually weakening at a rapid pace. This caused Shiryu and the others to be bewildered, and they had a stronger feeling that all of this was too strange. When something strange occurred, then there was definitely a reason. Shiryu and the others were immortal kings, so they were naturally very clearly aware that any slight unusual change definitely had a reason to it. Unfortunately, they were unable to deduce the reason, because they were in the God attainment region where the Heaven Tao was in chaos and karma was concealed. It caused them to be utterly unable to rely on their abilities of deducing the Heaven Tao to see through the secrets of this unusual change. It's weakening again. My God! Those bastards are even inferior to half-step immortal kings now. What are all of you standing there for? Quickly kill these bastards first. Heaven Trampler suddenly cried out loudly with pleasant surprise, and he didn't wait for the others to agree before charged out with the black and enormous axe in hand. Rumble! As he swung the enormous axe, countless Grand Sagittarius descendants were crushed into pieces in an instant, and he was like a whirlwind that didn't encounter any obstructive force at all. When they saw this, Shiryu and the others exchanged glances and couldn't be bothered to think about anything else before moving out successively. Around an eighth of an hour later, their group had successfully walked out of the Grand Sagittarius restriction. This sort of swift efficiency in clearing the restrictions caused Shiryu and the others to feel slight disbelief. For a time, they stood on the limestone path while slightly hesitating. Only the corners of Xianxia's mouth carried a wisp of an indistinct smile. Under the assistance of the river diagram fragments, he'd attained perfection in his grasp of the Tempest divine crest while within the Grand Sagittarius restriction. Needless to say, the unexpected changes in the river diagram fragments had truly started to give Xianxia pleasant surprises when he entered this god attainment palace. Earlier, no matter if it was the Godslaughter Bloodlands or while they traversed the path called Immortal King Burial, the river diagram fragments had always been taking away the Tao Spirit Pearl and Immortal King Saint Hearts he obtained. Yet now, this sort of unexpected awakening of the river diagram fragments was undoubtedly a type of return to him. This sort of feeling was too amazing. After experiencing the bewilderment and surprise at the beginning, Xianxia had finally calmed down and accepted this. But he couldn't avoid feeling pleasantly surprised. Let's go. I hope our luck will continue to be good like this. Yu and the others pondered and discussed about it for some time, yet were still unable to figure it out, so they could only restrain the bewilderment in their hearts and continue towards the next restriction of the gods. The fourth restriction was the Dragon Lair restriction. The fifth restriction was the Scorching Phoenix restriction. The sixth restriction was the Xieji restriction. As they continued through restriction after restriction, the speed and time that they utilized to pass through them grew quicker and quicker, and it was even to the extent that as time passed, Yu and the others felt that the restrictions weren't threatening and challenging at all. This caused the wonder in their hearts to grow, and they wondered if they'd taken the wrong path and hadn't entered the true God Attainment Palace. On the other hand, during this entire process, Xianxia benefited over and over again. He successively attained a perfect grasp of the Star Obliteration Divine Crest, Tai Chi Divine Crest, Enduring Divine Crest, and Risefall Divine Crest. However, the only regret he had was that the Spatial Divine Crest still remained at the fourth level, Spatial Tide, and it didn't receive any benefits from the river diagram fragments. This slightly puzzled Xianxia. When Xianxia entered the eighth restriction, the Clear Obliteration restriction, Xianxia didn't receive any further benefits. However, the unexpected awakening of the river diagram fragments within his sea of consciousness had arrived at its most intense state since he entered the God Attainment Palace. When their group walked out from the eighth restriction, Xianxia's mind droned before his entire body emanated a strange fluctuation that immediately caused the expressions of Yu and the others to change. A shapeless and obscure fluctuation stretched out like a ripple. It wasn't really strong. Yet when it swept past the bodies of Yu and the others, it caused a chill to run down their spines while their expressions instantly changed slightly. With their cultivations, they were actually unable to resist this fluctuation at all. Moreover, when the fluctuation flashed past their bodies, all of them felt as if the secrets in their hearts had been seen through. This sort of feeling seemed to be harmless, yet it was actually the most terrifying. It caused all of these immortal kings to be unable to help but reveal grim expressions while they became vigilant to the extreme. But right after that, their gazes were drawn over to Xianxia, because they noticed to their shock that this fluctuation had stretched out from Xianxia's body. What's going on? Could it be that Xianxia has suffered some sort of harm? At this moment, Xianxia's handsome face was calm. His eyes were clear and deep, and his entire body was enveloped by an obscure fluctuation, causing others to feel as if he was a terrifying and unfathomable abyss. It was like he'd instantaneously become a different person, and the aura that covered his entire body caused Yu and the other immortal kings to feel indescribably pressured. Before they could figure out everything that was happening before their eyes, Xianxia's figure suddenly moved slightly, and he actually strode forward with the intention of walking towards the next restriction of the gods. This caused Dian Dian to be shocked, and she intended to hurriedly move over and stop him, because she was very clearly aware that entering the restrictions of the gods was an extremely dangerous thing. Earlier, Yu and the others had no choice but to rely on the 5-color rock in Yu's possession in order to deal with the terrifying attacks within the divine restrictions. On the other hand, Xianxia was only at the golden immortal realm now. So not to mention resisting the force of the divine restriction, even slightly touching it would cause his entire body to be instantly turned into ash and perish on the spot. However, before Dian Dian could move to obstruct Xianxia, she was simultaneously stopped by Yu and Shangliuli. "Stop! Little brother Chen, she will be fine. Both of them spoke at the same time because they suddenly noticed that at the instant Xianxia took that stride, the ninth restriction, the Turtle King restriction, had suddenly activated by itself. It felt as if the restriction had taken the initiative to welcome Xianxia into it. Such an unexpected event caused Shi, Shangliu Li, Dian Dian, and Heaven Trampler to be dumbstruck. With their supreme experiences as immortal kings, they were still slightly unable to figure out everything that was occurring before their eyes. OM! A wave of fluctuation resounded. In the next moment, the scene before their eyes flashed, and they'd entered into the Turtle King restriction. The Turtle King restriction was a vast desert that was filled with countless primeval variant beasts, Herculean Turtle Kings. Herculean Turtle Kings were claimed to be the ancestors of the barbaric Herculean god, and every single one of them covered an area of 50,000 kilometers. According to legend, they were capable of moving while carrying a large world, and they possessed boundless strength and were peerlessly ferocious. There was even a true king turtle with the blood of the gods amongst them, and its strength was no different than that of a true god. If it was like before, then Shi and the others wouldn't be able to avoid a fierce battle after arriving here. Yet now, when they arrived within the Turtle King restriction under Xianxia's lead, they noticed to their astonishment that before they could launch any attacks, all the Herculean Turtle Kings in the boundless desert were collapsing while sorrowful howls filled the surroundings and blood dyed the sky red. When looked at from afar, it was like a shapeless hand had flashed through the desert, and everywhere it passed, none could bear the brunt of its might. This scene caused Shi and the others to be dumbstruck on the spot. Actually, with their current ability and Dao hearts, they'd experienced all sorts of shocking and dangerous incidents in the 3 dimensions. Yet the scene before their eyes had exceeded their expectations. After all, this was the restriction of the gods. It caused even immortal kings to face countless dangers upon entering it, and have no choice but to tread carefully because they were deeply afraid that the slightest mistake would bring disaster down upon them. Yet who would have expected that the restrictions of the gods that they took to be a dreadful monster would actually be wiped out so easily at this moment? It was precisely because this contrast was too great that Shi and the others were shocked and surprised. What exactly is going on? I don't know. Could it be that little brother Xianxia is an expert that concealed his strength? Shi and the others were surprised and bewildered as they discussed animatedly. Because at this moment, there was nothing for them to do, and they'd been reduced to becoming bystanders. Only Dian Dian puckered her lips and kept silent while her clear and beautiful eyes stared at Xianxia, who seemed to have become a completely different person. She faintly guessed that perhaps this was arranged by Oracle Mountain's youngest senior sister, Liang, or perhaps it was related to that river diagram fragment. OM! A wave of strange fluctuations resounded. Before Shi and the others could form a conclusion from their discussion, they'd already left the Turtle King restriction and had returned onto the limestone path. This time, Xianxia didn't stop, and he continued towards the next restriction of the gods as soon as they appeared on the limestone path. Thus, in the following period of time, Shi and the others became utterly free. They easily passed through restriction after restriction under Xianxia's lead, and it was practically easier than blowing off dust. During this entire process, the gazes Shi and the others shot at Xianxia became more and more strange. If they weren't deeply afraid of disturbing Xianxia, they would wish for nothing more than to press this fellow down to the ground and question him properly about everything that was happening at this moment. Of course, compared to this bit of curiosity, boundless happiness and excitement surged in all their hearts. Originally, I was worried that since we were a step slower than Swearin Ting's group, they'd probably obtain the method to become a god from the god attainment altar before us. Now it would seem like my worries were unnecessary. Shi roared with laughter, and he was extremely delighted. Indeed, earlier, after we entered the god attainment region, we overlooked little brother Xianxia's existence as we were concentrating on dealing with the various dangers we faced. Now the roles have been switched. He has become the leader, and we've become bystanders that have nothing to do. Shangliu Li smiled lightly. She seemed to be using a teasing tone, yet her words actually revealed boundless surprise, admiration, and happiness, and she didn't conceal her admiration towards Xianxia at all. It isn't just all of you. Earlier, when I noticed that this kid actually dared to run wild and come to the God Attainment region, it truly shocked me, and I was even thinking about how I should get him out of here. Now, this kid actually helped all of us greatly. Ha ha ha. The matters of the world really are unpredictable. Heaven Trampler roared with laughter. How could he not be happy when the restrictions within the God Attainment Palace weren't of any threat to him? He was naturally not running wild. Don't forget that Xianxia relied on the Tao Calamity Sword to save us when we were trapped in the 9-Heaven Calamity Tao Annihilation Divine Formation that day. Dian Dian puckered her lips and grinned because she felt proud of Xianxia's performance. Oh? Something like that actually happened. Heaven Trampler wasn't aware of this, so he couldn't help but be extremely surprised. Shiryu immediately described the situation at that time, and it caused Heaven Trampler to exclaim endlessly with surprise while even the gaze he shot at Xianxia changed. As they spoke with each other, they'd already passed through numerous restrictions under Xianxia's lead. Moreover, the further they went, the easier it became, and it caused them to seem like an extremely relaxed group of tourists that were taking a brief look at the scenery while chatting. If this scene were to be seen by the other immortal kings, it would definitely anger them to the point of spitting blood. Because the restrictions of the gods that they felt were terrifying like a natural chasm was actually extremely easy to pass through for them, so how could anyone not be disgruntled? Right, Miss Midnight, could it be that you brought Brother Xianxia along this time because you expected all of this? Asked Shiryu abruptly. This was already the second time he's asked such a question. The first time was after the 9-Heaven Calamity Tao Annihilation Divine Formation was destroyed, because he was extremely surprised when Xianxia utilized the Tao Calamity Sword to turn the situation around. Yet now, he clearly sensed that the obscure aura that enveloped Xianxia wasn't the energy of the Tao Calamity Sword, but it was even more miraculous than the Tao Calamity Sword. It seemed as if it innately countered the restrictions of the gods that were set up here. This naturally caused Shiryu to suspect that Xianxia had made sufficient preparations to deal with this dangerous place. Moreover, Xianxia was brought over by Midnight Immortal King, and that was the reason why Shiryu asked this question. As soon as these words were spoken, it caused Xiangliu Li and Heaven Trampler to look at Dian Dian in unison. Under such circumstances, Dian Dian was clearly aware that she couldn't conceal some things any longer. So she said frankly, I didn't know much about Xianxia before this, and the reason I asked him to work together with me was because a friend asked me to. Who? The spirits of Shiryu and the others were refreshed, and they revealed curious expressions. Oracle Mountain's youngest senior sister, Li Yang. Dian Dian answered readily. Oracle Mountain's Li Yang. In an instant, Shiryu immediately came to an understanding. If it's like this, then all of this is easily explainable. Could it be that Xianxia is a disciple of Oracle Mountain? Xiangliu Li didn't know of Xianxia's identity, so she couldn't refrain from asking. Shiryu immediately explained everything that happened in the Outer Rim battlefield to Xiangliu Li, and then he sighed with emotion. No wonder Master always said that if it's in terms of having the deepest comprehension of the workings of the heavens, then Oracle Mountain is number one in the 3 dimensions. Now it would seem like Oracle Mountain really deserves its reputation. The others sighed endlessly with emotion as well upon hearing this. Indeed, amongst the 3 supreme sects, Oracle Mountain had the least disciples, but all of them possessed the most mysterious and formidable strengths, and it was extremely difficult to find a trace of them in the world. Nuwas Dao Palace, on the other hand, was renowned for Dao techniques, and it was said to possess various rare and profound techniques from the primeval times until now. As for the sovereign sect, it was obvious. They pursued the Tao of emotionlessness. They severed all emotion and desire, and they were the sect amongst the 3 supreme sects that possessed the most disciples. Suddenly, Xianxia stopped moving forward, and it drew the attention of Shiryu and the others. Only now did they notice that they'd actually unknowingly arrived before the 36th restriction within the God Attainment Palace, and it was the final restriction in the God Attainment Palace. So long as they passed through it, then they would be able to see the God Attainment altar. Shiryu and the others instantly stopped talking while their attention moved towards Xianxia that stood there without moving. No wonder. So, it turns out that there's someone within the 36th restriction. After they observed the situation for a moment, Xiangliu Li guessed the reason why Xianxia was standing still, and the grudges and enmity within her surged into her heart. It's probably the sovereign sex group. As soon as these words were spoken, the gazes of Shiryu, Dian Dian, and Heaven Trampler turned cold as well, and they revealed a wisp of undisguised killing intent. There were a total of 36 restrictions of the gods in the God Attainment Palace. They were like barriers that others could only wait behind while someone was challenging it, and it was impossible to take a step forward. So even though they'd guessed that it was the sovereign sex Swearin Ting and Zhang Lingxiao who were within the final restriction, Shiryu and the others could only wait, and they were unable to disturb them at all. However, this sort of wait wouldn't go on for long because every single restriction had a fixed amount of time, and those who exceeded that time and were unable to pass through the restriction would be trapped within it. Moreover, it would be impossible for them to escape it after that. For example, the 36th restriction before their eyes, the stone plate restriction, had time restriction of 6 hours. I never expected that these two fellows would pass through the restrictions rather quickly. Shiryu laughed coldly while his gaze was completely icy cold, and a wisp of killing intent uncontrollably surged out from his heart. The God Attainment Altar is right after the stone plate restriction. If they arrive there before us and take the method to become a god from the altar, then the situation would be bad. Shangliu Li's considerations were much more comprehensive, and her beautiful brows knit together as she spoke. The God Attainment Altar could hold up the sky and had stood there through the ages, whereas the method to attain the Tao and become a god was hidden on the altar. Presently, they were already a step slower than Swearin Ting's group, and the situation wasn't promising. There's no need to worry, it isn't so easy to ascend the God Attainment Altar. If the God Attainment Palace was said to be a test of an immortal king's strength, then the God Attainment Altar is a test of the immortal king laws. When the time comes, we'll still have an extremely great chance to turn the situation around if we spare no efforts. Dian Dian smiled from the side, and then her gaze descended onto Chen Shi. Not to mention that we have brother Chen Shi's assistance. So this 36th restriction of the gods exists only in name to us, and it won't be long before we'll be able to catch up to the sovereign sex footsteps. This little fellow seems as if he's about to break through. Right at this moment, Heaven Trampler suddenly exclaimed with shock. All of them looked over. Sure enough, they saw that the vital energy in Chen Shi's entire body was surging and pulsing, and his entire body was emanating violent divine radiance. It was actually the sign that he was about to advance into the Saint Immortal realm. He's actually advancing now? All of them were stunned, and they felt slight disbelief. Since the ancient times until now, Chen Shi is probably the first little fellow that advanced in the God Attainment Palace, right? Before they could continue sighing with emotion, Chen Shi suddenly sat down cross-legged on the ground while the space between his brows carried a calm and composed expression. On the other hand, the essence, energy, and spirit in his entire body erupted like a volcano, and it started to surge, blaze, seethe, rumble. It was a rather magnificent sight. As existences that had experienced this in the past, Shiryu and the others were naturally clearly aware that Chen Shi was about to charge into the Saint Immortal realm. This was the barrier to step into the path towards becoming a god, and no disturbance could be tolerated at this moment. The situation is probably taking a turn for the worse now. Normally, advancing to the Saint Immortal realm requires at least a few hours or even 3 to 5 days. In this way, we'll probably be unable to catch up to the sovereign sect any longer. Shangliu Li frowned as she spoke. This was a problem indeed, because Swearin Ting and Zhang Lingxiao were currently fighting their way through the final restriction of the gods with all their strengths. So they had to make the best use of their time and immediately enter the final restriction as soon as Swearin Ting and Zhang Lingxiao passed through it. But it just so happened that Chen Shi had actually started to break through at this moment. In this way, it would definitely affect their forward pace, and it was even to the extent that it might cause them to miss the chance to enter the God Attainment Altar and obtain the secret to become a god. Shiryu and Heaven Trampler frowned as well, and they felt that the situation was slightly difficult to deal with. We would probably still be struggling at the first few restrictions now if we didn't have Chen Shi's help, and it would be utterly impossible for us to arrive here in such a short period of time. Dian Dian had a calm expression instead and spoke slowly. So all of you don't have to feel anxious. If there's really no other choice, Then once Swearenting's group passes through the final restriction, you three can immediately head forward to challenge the restriction, whereas I'll stay here to protect Xianxia so as to avoid him being disturbed. This, even though sure you and the others were very clearly aware that Dian Dian's suggestion was the most rational, they faintly felt terrible in their hearts when they thought about how Xianxia had helped them arrive here. Yet they were about to leave in advance. It's decided. It's impossible for Xianxia to attain the Tao and become a god. But to us immortal kings, once we miss this chance, then we may not necessarily be able to encounter it in the future. Dian Dian said with a smile. Of course, if all of you obtained the method to become a god, then give me a copy as well. Of course. Sure you and the others were clearly aware that they couldn't hesitate at this moment, and they decided immediately. Unfortunately, even then, they were still slightly worried in their hearts. After all, the reason they were able to arrive here so swiftly was entirely because of Xianxia. Now, they wondered how long they would spend to pass through the final restriction without Xianxia's help. Moreover, the longer they spent, the worse the situation they were in would be, and it would instead be even more beneficial for Swearenting and Zhang Lingxiao. This was something that couldn't be helped. They could only act in this way. Xianxia was unaware of all of this. It was even to the extent that Xianxia had completely lost his perception towards the surroundings after he walked out of the 8th restriction, the clear obliteration restriction. Because at that time, the unexpected awakening of the river diagram fragments had arrived at its most intense moment, and the strange fluctuations emanated by it enveloped his entire mind, body, and soul, causing him to fall completely into a strange state. Under this sort of state, various talismans ceaselessly flashed into appearance within his mind. They twisted about like worms and tadpoles, and they were mysterious and obscure as they spun about without end in his mind. Xianxia was utterly unaware that he'd led all of them through numerous restrictions of the gods, but he was able to clearly sense that more and more mysterious talismans were surging into his body while his consciousness grew more and more hazy. Amongst those talismans that surged endlessly into his body, besides a small portion that transformed into the quintessence energy of the Grand Tao for him to absorb, the rest were completely absorbed by the river diagram fragments. Otherwise, with his current cultivation, he would be utterly unable to contain such a huge amount of terrifying and powerful energy. Even then, the small portion of quintessence energy of the Grand Tao were like potent medicine that completely condensed the immortal force within the world in his body. It was originally bright gold in color, yet it now carried a clear color that seemed like the color of a lake. It was precisely under such circumstances that she suddenly felt the arrival of a critical factor to advance, and he didn't even have the time to react before he'd fallen into a state of advancement. Rumble! Rumble! It was like thunderclaps were resounding and volcanoes were erupting in his body. After his terrifying immortal force contained countless amounts of quintessence energy of the Grand Tao, it had already started seething and blazing to the limit. When looked at from afar, his entire body emanated golden light and surging divine flames. Moreover, strands of obscure and mysterious auras of the Tao drifted out from every single pore on his body. This sort of state didn't continue for long, and it was practically completed in an instant. After that, he heard a bang resound. Xianxia's entire body seemed as if it had received sudden enlightenment. The essence, energy, spirit, soul, and Tao heart in his body suddenly and simultaneously underwent a shocking transformation at this instant. His imposing aura was rising steadily. His cultivation was improving madly. His immortal force was condensing without end. His soul was strengthening swiftly. The path towards becoming a god came from the quintessence of the Tao. Because whether one obtained the quintessence energy of the Grand Tao determined if a saint immortal was natural or artificial. No matter if it was the strength they possessed or the sex they created in the future, artificial saint immortals couldn't compare to natural saint immortals. This was like the difference between the half-step immortal king realm and the immortal king realm. The only difference was that half-step immortal kings still had the chance to charge into the immortal king realm, whereas artificial saint immortals could only stop there on their path towards the Tao, and it was impossible for them to attain the immortal king realm. Moreover, because of the scarcity of the quintessence energy of the Grand Tao, Practically 90% of Saint Immortals in the Immortal dimension were artificial Saint Immortals. However, Xianxia was different. Early on, when he'd just advanced into the advanced stage of the Golden Immortal Realm, he'd obtain a strand of the quintessence energy of the Grand Tao from the river diagram fragments, and it was sufficient for him to advance into the ranks of natural Saint Immortals. Now, after he entered the God Attainment Palace and under the unexpected awakening of the river diagram fragments, he didn't just condense all the laws he possessed into all-heaven divine crests. He'd even attained perfection in his grasp of every single all-heaven divine crest. Up until now, he'd even absorbed a steady flow of the quintessence energy of the Grand Tao from the talismans that surged endlessly into his body. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for him to not advance even if he didn't want to. Couldn't be helped. It was extremely difficult for others to obtain even a strand of the quintessence energy of the Grand Tao. Yet to Xianxia, his entire body was currently immersed in the quintessence energy of the Grand Tao. So when the two were compared, the disparity was instantly obvious. Most importantly, the energy emanated by river diagram fragments was too strange. It didn't just absorb the energy of the talismans within the restrictions of the gods, it even gave extraordinary benefits to Xianxia. So when he advanced at this moment, it was practically as easy as breaking through a piece of window paper, and he stepped into the Saint Immortal realm without any effort at all. If this scene were to be seen by those cultivators that bitterly pursued the Saint Immortal realm, they would definitely spit blood from their envy and cry, "Isn't this a bit too easy?" Once one advanced into the Saint Immortal realm, one's immortal force would transform into a pure and translucent clear color. It was like a clear sky, and it was boundlessly vast. It was called Saint Immortal Force. For example, since they started cultivation, innate saints already possessed energy of such level, and this obviously showed how formidable the strength they revealed would be. Swish! Right when Xianxia advanced, a strand of fluctuation suddenly arose from the final restriction, and then Ting and Zhang Lingxiao's figures walked out from within it. Both of them were in an extremely sorry state. Their countenance was completely pale, yet the excitement and delight in the space between their brows was impossible to conceal because they'd finally passed through the God Attainment Palace. Both of them raised their eyes and looked up, and then an ancient and towering altar instantly occupied their field of vision and minds. The God Attainment Altar. Ting's eyes glowed brightly, and it shot out like a bolt of lightning while he couldn't restrain himself from roaring with laughter any longer. Becoming a god. Becoming a god. I've waited too long for this day. The fluctuation from the 36th restriction drew the attention of Yu and the others as well. Shit. They've broken out of the restriction. Yu frowned while his eyes were filled with a serious expression. This scene had occurred too swiftly. They'd just arrived here for less than 10 minutes of time, yet Ting and Zhang Lingxiao had broken out of the restriction, and this had exceeded Yu's expectations. There's no time to wait. Let's go. Shangliu Li practically didn't hesitate at all before she decided. According to Dian Dian's suggestion from before, Yu, Heaven Trampler, and her would set out to compete with the Sovereign Sect, whereas Dian would stay behind instead and look after Xianxia, who was breaking through. This was something that they'd agreed on earlier. At this moment, when they saw the auras of Ting and Zhang Lingxiao vanish from within the divine restriction, they didn't dare hesitate and intended to head out together. Swish! However, before you could activate the 5-color rock, Xianxia, who was originally breaking through, had suddenly stood up, and his entire body emanated a strand of a shapeless and strange fluctuation that swept towards the surroundings. This scene was too sudden. No one had expected that Xianxia, who was in the middle of breaking through, would actually take such action at this moment, and for a time all of them had slightly astounded expressions. However, something that was even more unbelievable to them occurred. Xianxia actually walked towards the 36th divine restriction. Not one of them had ever seen something that went against convention like this. Xianxia was breaking through. It was a moment of life and death, and the slightest disturbance would cause him to suffer from qi deviation or even perish. Yet Xianxia actually stepped into the final restriction while breaking through. However, they were unaware that Xianxia had already broken through to the Saint Immortal realm a long time ago, and he just didn't have the time to consolidate his cultivation before his aura was once again completely enveloped by the river diagram fragments, causing his mind and soul to once again fall into that strange state. But no matter how astounded and puzzled they were, after Shiryu and the others noticed that she didn't show any signs of suffering from chi deviation, they were still extremely happy in their hearts. Because passing through the final restriction under Xi's lead was something that would be completed in a matter of moments. Even though they were still a step slower than Ting and Jiang Lingxiao, it was already sufficient to make up for this gap. After all, if they were to overcome the restriction themselves, it would probably waste even more time. After a short moment, it was just as Shiryu and the others had expected. Under Xi's lead, they overcame the final restriction without any effort at all, and their figures flashed before they appeared within an expanse of boundless chaotic space. Only an altar stood towering within the boundless space. It towered into the sky and was completely pitch black, and it was like a pathway that led to the world outside the 3 dimensions. This altar was solemn, silent, and extremely ancient, and it seemed to have been standing here for innumerable years. When looked at from afar, it caused a wisp of reverence and devotion to arise in the hearts of all. When they saw this scene, Shiryu, Shangliuli, Dian, and Heaven Trampler's bodies shook simultaneously while their eyes erupted with divine radiance, and it was impossible to conceal their excitement and happiness. The God Attainment Altar. They'd finally arrived here. From the God-Slaughter Bloodlands, to the boundless space that was called the Immortal King Burial, to the God Attainment Palace, and finally through the 36 restrictions of the gods. They'd experienced countless dangers and calamities, and they'd finally safely arrived before the God Attainment Altar, and were about to search for the secret technique to attain the Tao and become a god. At this moment, how could they not be excited? Look over there. Quickly. Suddenly, Shangliuli spoke while pointing toward the God Attainment Altar in the distance. When they looked towards the direction she pointed at, Shiryu and the others noticed that there were 2 figures at the bottom of the God Attainment Altar that were ascending it step by step. Surprisingly, it was Ting and Jiang Lingxiao. In an instant, the excitement and happiness in their eyes was completely replaced by a wisp of a ghastly and murderous expression. They were very clearly aware that the only barrier between them and the method to become a god was these 2 disciples of the sovereign sect. "We can finally take revenge," Shangliuli muttered while her voice revealed a strand of hatred. "Of course, we aren't just going to find the method to become a god this time. We'll also annihilate these 2 damnable bastards here." Shiryu gnashed his teeth with hatred as well. As they spoke with each other, they were just about to make a move when they suddenly felt a wave of fluctuation come from behind them. What happened? Could it be the help of the gods? How unbelievable! Truly unbelievable! Who could have imagined that the restrictions of the gods within the God Attainment Palace would actually suddenly lose all their might? It actually seemed as if half of it was completely wiped out by someone. Haha! Isn't that for the best? Look! Quickly! Isn't that the God Attainment Altar? A wave of clamorous voice that contained pleasant surprise resounded. Along with these voices, the figure of Ranfeng Sun Wuhan, and the other 2 immortal kings just flashed over and just happened to stand by the side of Shiryu and the others. A wisp of shock, surprise, and pleasant surprise still remained on their faces, and they seemed to find everything before their eyes slightly difficult to believe. Earlier, they were originally fighting in the Shaman Python restriction, and they were in a precarious situation. They were about to lose hope in being able to overcome the restriction when an unexpected event occurred abruptly. The Shaman Python restriction they resided in actually collapsed and disintegrated into nothingness in an instant. It wasn't just that, when they returned from the Shaman Python restriction, all the other restrictions on the limestone path vanished in an instant before their eyes, and it was as if someone had forcefully wiped out all the restrictions, causing not even a trace of its aura to remain. This naturally made them feel surprised, shocked, and pleasantly surprised, because along with the restrictions of the gods vanishing, they'd instantly passed through the God Attainment Palace and arrived here. The entire process was so easy as if they were taking an idle stroll through a courtyard, and it caused them to be slightly unable to believe it even until now. However, when they saw Shiryu and the others who stood by their sides, their voices instantly stopped abruptly, while their expressions calmed down and was replaced by a wisp of vigilance. Even then, Shiryu and the others still heard their conversations clearly, causing Shiryu and the others to instantly sigh. They understood that all of this was perhaps related to the fact that Xianxia had broken through the final restriction. The facts were indeed so. Even though Xianxia had advanced into the Saint Immortal realm in an absurd and bizarre way, the unexpected awakening of the river diagram fragments still hadn't ended. Especially after he walked into the final restriction, the river diagram fragments seemed as if they'd been infuriated, causing the strange fluctuation it emanated to grow stronger and stronger. So, Shiryu and the others didn't even have to do anything before the restriction was completely destroyed. The destruction of the final restriction was like the straw that broke the camel's back, and it caused all of the restrictions in the God Attainment Palace to lose their might. Shiryu and the others became vigilant when facing Ranfeng and the others who'd suddenly appeared here. Their gazes met with each other, and all of them revealed a wisp of hostility. The atmosphere became silent and confrontational. However, from the beginning until the end, no one noticed that at this moment, as Xianxia looked towards the distant God Attainment altar and the chaotic space above the altar, his clear and deep eyes flickered with wisps of surging flames of rage. At this moment, his consciousness had regained its clarity, and he was naturally able to perceive that he seemed to have seen the God Attainment altar and the chaotic space before him in the past. It was after he'd fused with the sixth river diagram fragment that Dian gave him. A fluctuation arose in his sea of consciousness before numerous mysterious and grand scenes appeared before his eyes. Amongst them was an ancient altar that towered into the sky. There was also a chart that seemed like a picture scroll, and it lay across the chaotic space above the altar. It was concealed by the mist, and he wasn't able to see it clearly. Most importantly, there was a mysterious eye within the chaotic space. That eye was pitch black, icy cold, and indifferent. It seemed as if countless talismans were flickering within it, and it revealed the scenes of the rise and fall of the heavens and the earth, the movements of the stars, the passage of time, the changes in the universe. Xianxia still remembered feeling as if his entire body had gone cold from falling into an icy pit, and the rage, detest, and ruthlessness he felt upon looking at that mysterious eye. At this moment, he finally dared confirm that the ancient altar he'd seen that day was the God Attainment altar of legend. All of this allowed Xianxia to understand that the river diagram fragments he possessed were definitely related to this God Attainment altar. Otherwise he would have absolutely not been able to witness the scene at this place within his sea of consciousness before he even arrived here. Moreover, at this moment, as he looked at the God Attainment altar from afar and recalled the mysterious eye that he'd seen in his sea of consciousness, an uncontrollable strand of rage and detest surged into Xianxia's heart once more. This sort of feeling was extremely strange. It was as if his mind and heart suddenly had another layer of feelings, and it hadn't occupied his mind, yet directly affected his actions and will. Xianxia didn't resist it, and he couldn't feel any intent to go against it. It was as if he should possess these unfamiliar feelings. This allowed him to faintly guess that perhaps all of this came from the river diagram fragments. Let's go! Right amidst this deathly silent atmosphere, Shiryu suddenly withdrew his gaze and instructed in a low voice. Before they ascended to the peak of the God Attainment altar, it wasn't suitable for them to fight with their rivals yet. Coupled with the fact that Ting and Jiang Lingxiao were approaching the peak of the God Attainment altar in the distance. Such circumstances didn't allow them to start a fight and go against Ranfeng's group. Shangliu Li, Dian, and Heaven Trampler were naturally clearly aware of this. So when Shiryu made this decision, they decided to leave as well. Let's go as well. Ranfeng and the others heaved sighs of relief when they heard this. Perhaps they could still talk with Shiryu's group while they were still outside the God Attainment Palace because there was no conflict between their groups. But when they were before the God Attainment altar, they were each other's competition. Competition meant that they weren't on the same side, and it was even to the extent that conflicts might be impossible to avoid. But these sort of conflicts wouldn't occur right now. After all, they hadn't ascended the God Attainment altar yet. So engaging in conflict at this moment would only benefit Ting and Jiang Lingxiao, and it was utterly disadvantageous to them. Both sides immediately turned around at the same time with tacit understanding and flashed towards the god attainment altar in the distance. It was also at this moment that Xianxia suddenly raised his head, and this inadvertent glance of his actually noticed an icy cold, indifferent, and mysterious eye flash within the chaotic space that enveloped the sky. Who exactly does that eye belong to? This question couldn't help but arise in Xianxia's heart, and the flames of rage in his eyes burned even more brightly. The god attainment altar towered into the sky and existed since the ancient times, and it was covered in obscure and chaotic mist. One would only notice how tiny one was when standing before it and looking up at it. One was simply like an ant standing before a towering mountain, and it was impossible to see where the top of the altar lay. The god attainment altar was completely pitch black while a flat limestone path lay at the bottom of the altar. It was smooth like a mirror, and it emanated an ancient and desolate aura. Swoosh! Shiryu and the others appeared here out of thin air, and a wisp of excitement surged from their hearts as they gazed at this limestone path that led straight to the god attainment altar. To all of these immortal kings, the limestone path was undoubtedly the god attainment path, because so long as they were able to reach the end of the path, then they would have the opportunity to obtain the method to become a god. Everyone be careful. The surroundings of the god attainment altar is densely covered in the restrictions of the gods, and we can only rely on the immortal king laws we possess to ascend it. Moreover, we can't act rashly, otherwise our lives would probably be in danger. Shiryu reminded. From the ancient times until now, this limestone path on the god attainment altar was called the god attainment path. It was filled with restrictions, and one could only rely on the immortal king laws one possessed to resist and deal with the pressure emanated by the restrictions. In other words, the stronger the immortal king laws one possessed, the swifter one would be able to ascend to the peak of the god attainment altar. Conversely, if the immortal king laws one possessed wasn't sufficiently deep and formidable, then it wouldn't just affect one's speed up the altar, one might even be restrained and suppressed to the point of being unable to take a step forward. Shangliu Li, Dian Dian, and Heaven Trampler were naturally clearly aware of all of this, and they nodded immediately. But right after that, Dian Dian was stunned as she said, "What about Xianxia?" As soon as these words were spoken, all of them looked at Xianxia and couldn't help but feel slightly ashamed in their hearts. Earlier, they'd paid too much attention to the god attainment altar, and they'd actually overlooked Xianxia's existence. The reason they felt ashamed was that Xianxia had helped them greatly earlier, yet they were fully concentrated on thinking about how to obtain the method to become a god, causing them to overlook Xianxia slightly. Thus, they naturally felt ashamed in their hearts. After they received Dian Dian's reminder, they came to an understanding as well. Xianxia wasn't an immortal king yet, so how could he possibly step foot into the god attainment path that led to the peak of the altar? After all, throughout the countless years since the ancient times until now, they'd never heard of a golden immortal being able to pass through the god attainment palace and step foot on the god attainment path. But if they made Xianxia stay here, then what if one of the other immortal kings that had come here aroused ill intent towards Xianxia? That immortal king would be able to instantly take Xianxia's life. What should we do? Shiryu and the others frowned, and they were slightly troubled. However, they'd utterly not noticed that Xianxia was already a saint immortal now. He'd long since stepped onto the cultivation path towards becoming a god. However, because the river diagram fragment's aura had concealed his own, it caused the aura around his body to be obscure, mysterious, and impossible to see through. Swoosh! Right at this moment, Yi Ranfeng, Sun Wuhan, and the other two immortal kings arrived at the bottom of the god attainment altar as well. As soon as they appeared here, they were slightly stunned. They seemed to have never expected that Shiryu and the others didn't make the best use of their time to ascend the altar and were standing here instead. However, when they saw Xianxia, they instantly had a rough understanding, and a wisp of a strange smile couldn't help but suffuse the corners of their mouths. Early on, while they were still at the god attainment palace, they'd noticed that Xianxia was only at the golden immortal realm, and at that time they wondered why Shiryu and the others would bring such a junior in here. Now, even though they hadn't determined the secrets behind this, when they saw Shiryu and the others were hesitant because of Xianxia, they couldn't help but take slight pleasure towards Shiryu and the others' misfortune. Of course, they didn't have the time to tease and ridicule Shiryu's group at a time like this. They turned around and headed up the limestone path towards the god attainment altar under Ironfeng's lead. Yu and the others couldn't help but frown when they saw this. How about, I stay behind and take care of Xianxia? Dian perceived the thoughts of the others, and she knew that they couldn't delay any longer, so she spoke immediately. However, before she could finish speaking, she saw Xianxia suddenly raise his leg and moved towards the god attainment altar. This scene caused Yu and the others to be stunned. They recalled the scene of Xianxia leading them through the restrictions in the god attainment palace, and they couldn't help but feel curious in their hearts. Could it be that Xianxia can traverse the god attainment path as well? When they thought about it carefully, they realized that since they entered the god attainment palace, Xianxia seemed to have become a completely different person. He was silent and constantly made some unexpected actions, and it caused even all them who were immortal kings to be extremely shocked. However, even though they were puzzled, Xianxia's unusual actions had helped them greatly. So when they saw Xianxia act unusually once more and step foot onto the god attainment path now, they weren't really shocked. But they still couldn't avoid feeling worried for Xianxia, and they were worried that he would be harmed. Let's protect him from the side, and if he activates the restrictions in the surroundings of the god attainment altar, then we'll rescue him and stop him from taking any further reckless action. Yu instructed swiftly, and the others nodded in agreement. Step, step. Xianxia's footsteps were steady and unhurried. They were neither fast nor slow, and he walked step by step up the limestone path. When he took the first step up the god attainment altar, the eyes of Yu and the others narrowed, and they were prepared to assist Xianxia at the first possible moment. A strand of a terrifying energy of divinity surged from the god attainment altar, and it shot towards Xianxia. Shit! Dian's reaction was the swiftest. She stretched out her fair hand and grabbed at Xianxia with the intention of pulling him back out. The others acted instinctively as well with the intention of rescuing Xianxia. Otherwise, if the terrifying energy of the restriction collided with Xianxia's body, then he would absolutely be annihilated in an instant. Bang! A wave of intense fluctuations arose. To their shock, all their aid had failed. It wasn't dealt with by the energy of the god attainment altar, and it was instead obstructed by the obscure aura that effused out from Xianxia's body. It was 4 immortal kings that had taken action to rescue Xianxia. Even though they were trying to rescue him, but how could it possibly be something that a golden immortal could refuse and obstruct? Swish! Before they could recover from their shock, the energy that surged out from the god attainment altar had charged towards Xianxia, yet it was like water that had encountered a rock. It swept off towards Xianxia's surroundings, yet didn't bring any harm to Xianxia instead. Yu and the others were dumbstruck. What? It wasn't just them. Ranfeng and the others who just started ascending the god attainment altar had noticed this scene as well, and they were extremely surprised as well. This junior is really strange. He really is. However, it's probably that the divinity within the restriction only targets immortal kings, and it doesn't work against a weak junior like him, right? Forget it. Continue forward. Their surprise only lasted for a moment, and it wasn't long before they continued forward. This was the god attainment altar, and every single one of them suffered the pressure of terrifying restrictions, so they didn't dare get distracted and pay attention to others. Step, step. Xianxia seemed to have not noticed all of this, and he continued up the god attainment altar step by step. Come on, let's follow him. Yu was the first to recover from his shock. Even if his heart was filled with questions, it was impossible for him to watch Xianxia act alone at this moment. All of them immediately moved out. Actually, Xianxia's display allowed them to heave sighs of relief in their hearts. At the very least, they didn't have to hesitate like they had earlier. The god attainment altar towered countless kilometers into the sky. Even if it was an immortal king that wished to ascend it, the immortal king could only ascend step by step. In this way, it would take an extremely long time for one to ascend the peak of the altar. The reason for this was that the entire god attainment altar was covered in restrictions, and the terrifying pressure emanated by these restrictions forced every single immortal king that intended to ascend to the peak of the altar to resist and deal with this pressure. On the other hand, There was only a single method to resist and deal with this pressure: one's immortal king laws. The limestone path that led to the peak of the God Attainment altar was extremely wide, and it was over 30 kilometers in width. The path ascended level after level, and it was called the God Attainment path. Only when one walked on the limestone path would one notice that it was branded with countless mysterious and obscure patterns, and they emanated the energy of divinity that caused even immortal kings to feel terrified. As he walked step by step on the God Attainment path, it wasn't long before Shiryu frowned. He looked at Xianxia, who was walking before him, and a wisp of bewilderment flashed within his eyes. However, he didn't say anything in the end. Something seemed to be off. At the same time, Shangliu Li, Dian Dian, and Heaven Trampler were slightly bewildered in their hearts as well. Since the moment they stepped foot onto the God Attainment path that led to the peak of the altar, they sensed the pressure of divinity emanated by the restrictions, and it pressed down upon them to the point they had no choice but to circulate their immortal king laws to resist it. But the oppressive force was slightly weak. They raised their eyes and looked towards the distance. They saw Ronfeng's group of 4 were walking forward step by step 3 kilometers ahead. Their footsteps were slow, and every single one of them carried a heavy and strenuous expression. Compared to Ranfeng and the others, their speed was simply more than 2 times quicker. Do you feel that it's slightly strange? If this continues, then we wouldn't just be able to quickly surpass Ranfeng's group. We'll even be able to catch up to Suiren Ting and Zhang Lingxiao, who were in the lead. Have all of you forgotten what we encountered in the God Attainment Palace? All of this is probably related to little brother Chun-Shi. Shiryu and the others conversed briefly before placing their attention on Chen, she who strode before them, and their expressions more or less carried a wisp of admiration, bewilderment, and shock. Since they'd entered the God Attainment region, Chun-Shi had given them too many pleasant surprises. No matter if it was the Tao Calamity Sword, or successively passing through the restrictions in the God Attainment Palace, it puzzled and shocked all of them. Especially now, when they sensed that the pressure emanated from the restrictions on the God Attainment path might have weakened because of Chun-Shi, the shock in their hearts was indescribable. This was the God Attainment altar. Since the prehistoric times until now, countless immortal kings had perished here. Yet now, a young man that hadn't attained the immortal king realm had stepped foot here, and he was too superior to be compared with the immortal kings of the past. No matter who saw this scene, their hearts would probably be unable to maintain its calm. How could this be possible? Suddenly, an exclaim of shock arose from afar. Ranfeng had inadvertently turned around, and when he saw Shiryu and the others were only around 50 m away from catching up to his group, he was instantly shocked while even his face twitched. How terrifying was the energy of the restrictions that suffused the God Attainment altar. Chun-Shi was unable to sense it. At this moment, his mind was occupied by a strand of feelings that were unfamiliar to him, and his calm and handsome face revealed an expression of rage and detest. As he approached step by step towards the peak of the God Attainment altar, these feelings grew stronger and stronger, and it was on the verge of drowning his mind. However, Chun-Shi wasn't afraid of these sort of feelings, nor did he resist it at all. It was just as he'd sensed earlier, these unfamiliar feelings came from the river diagram fragments, and it was a part of him. He was able to sense the surprised and puzzled gazes Shiryu and the others shot at him, yet he didn't know how to explain it, so he chose to maintain silence. It was even to the extent that he was able to sense that he was gradually losing control over his body, yet he didn't know how to resist it and thus chose to resign himself to it. Chun-Shi walked forward step by step amidst this strange state. Comparatively speaking, he was even more puzzled, bewildered, and surprised than Shiryu and the others. But because he was clearly aware that all of this was caused by the river diagram fragments, he seemed to be extremely calm instead. Ranfeng's surprise drew the attention of Sun Wuhan and the others. In the next moment, all of them noticed as well that Shiryu and the others were catching up to them under Chun-Shi's lead. Moreover, Shiryu and the other speed forward was more than an entire 2 times swifter than their current speed. Thus, Sun Wuhan and the others were surprised and puzzled, and they felt an indescribable feeling of urgency. On the God Attainment altar, The difference of a single step might cause one to miss the chance to obtain the method to become a god. Now, when they saw that Yu and the others were about to surpass them, how could they not become anxious? Move! Quickly! Make the best use of our time! Damn it! Why is this happening? The expressions of Ranfeng and the others turned gloomy, and they went silent while their brows knit together silently before they placed all their attention onto the god attainment path beneath their feet. However, they felt helpless and even hateful because no matter how hard they tried, they were unable to turn the situation around. Yu and the others were catching up to them step by step, and then Yu and the others surpassed them step by step while gradually pulling apart the distance between air groups. Should we attack? When they saw the figures of Yu and the others were moving further off into the distance, one of them felt disgruntled and sent a murderous voice transmission to the others. He had an emaciated face, eye sockets that sunk into his skull, a bald head, and a broad mouth. His name was Pangdu, and he was the master of one of the prehistoric sects, the True Court sect. They're the disciples of Nuwas Dao Palace. We may not succeed even if the four of us join forces against them. Sun Wuhan frowned and he refused. That may not necessarily be the case. This is the God attainment altar that's filled with restrictions that contain divinity. Even if we can't defeat them, it'll be sufficient to slow them down, so they can't obtain the method to become gods. A middle-aged man in beast skin clothes with angular muscles, a mighty figure, and bronze skin spoke fiercely. He was called Dao Yao, and he was the master of one of the prehistoric sects, the Blood Cloud sect. Sun Wuhan's brows knit together even more tightly when he heard Pangdu and Dao Yao both speak with the intention of obstruction Yu's group, and he shot his gaze towards Ranfeng that had remained silent since the beginning. In their group of four, Ranfeng had always held the position of leader, so now it came down to whether Ranfeng agreed or not. Don't forget that the sovereign sects Xuerenting and Jiang Lingxiao are up ahead. They'll definitely not watch idly as Yu and the others step foot onto the peak of the altar before them. Ranfeng was silent for a short moment before he spoke slowly. So in this way, a conflict might erupt between them? Sun Wuhan's brows raised. That's a good opportunity. If they enter into combat with each other, then we'll just happen to be able to reap the rewards. Perhaps we'll even be able to arrive at the peak of the altar before them. Ranfeng glanced at Sun Wuhan with praise. I think so too. Pangdu and Dao Yao instantly kept silent when they heard Ranfeng clarify his opinion. The top of the God attainment altar could be seen from afar. It was an ancient flat platform covered within the chaotic mist, and it was indistinctly visible, mysterious, and alluring. A wisp of burning anticipation arose in Xuerenting's eyes when he saw this. Only 9 kilometers left. Once I arrive at the top of the altar, I'll be able to search for the method to become a god. Up until this point, Xuerenting had endured a great deal of pressure. Even if his cultivation was extraordinary, it was still rather strenuous for him to face the terrifying pressure from the restrictions. Especially as he ascended higher up, the pressure from the restrictions grew stronger, and it caused him to not dare slack off. His body was tense at all times while he resisted the shapeless pressure. Junior Sister Jiang. Exactly which part of the peak of the altar stores the method to become a god? Suddenly, Xuerenting asked via voice transmission. According to the sect master, the peak of the altar is enormous, and it's enveloped by the chaotic mist. There are Tao fruit spirits on it. If we're able to obtain it, then the god tablet will descend, and it wouldn't be long before we're listed as gods. Jiang Lingxiao smiled and spoke casually. Tao fruit spirit. A wisp of bright light flashed past Xuerenting's eyes when he heard these words. He was naturally clearly aware that this was a type of divine treasure that was born within the mysterious god domain that resided outside the 3 dimensions. It was like a foundation-building pill, but the Tao fruit spirit built the foundation of a god. On the other hand, the god tablet represented one's status as having attained the Tao and become a god. According to legend, every single god possessed his own godhood, and that was the god tablet. If one was unable to obtain the god tablet, then even if one obtained the Tao fruit spirit, one was bound to be an artificial god and be unable to break free from the restraints of the 3 dimensions to exist eternally. Tao Fruit Spirit, God Tablet. This time, they'll definitely be mine. Swearin Ting's eyes burned with anticipation while he muttered in his heart. This doesn't look good. Sure, you and the others are actually on the verge of catching up. Right at this moment, Jiang Lingxiao's voice sounded out by Swearin Ting's ears, causing his heart to shake before he swiftly turned around and looked over. Sure enough, he saw that a group of people were walking over step by step a few km away. Surprisingly, it was Sure Yu and the others. Especially shocking to Swearin Ting was that Sure Yu's group speed forward was actually slightly swifter than him and Jiang Lingxiao. These bastards actually didn't die in the God Attainment Palace. Swearin Ting's brows knit together while he revealed an icy cold expression. He was slightly puzzled because he'd clearly set up numerous obstructions and utilized sacrificial blood to completely activate the might of the 36 restrictions of the gods within the God Attainment Palace. Logically speaking, even if a true god entered into the palace, the god would probably be heavily injured and on the verge of death. Yet now, Sure Yu and the others were actually still alive. Moreover, they'd even arrived at the God Attainment altar so swiftly. All of this had exceeded the expectations of Swearin Ting, and it caused his expression to instantly turn gloomy. If they continue according to their current speed, then they'll be able to surpass us before we arrive at the peak of the altar. Jiang Lingxiao's pretty and gently face carried a wisp of a heavy expression. The most troublesome thing is that if they catch up to us and then attack us, we'll be in a slightly bad situation. She wasn't wrong. No matter if it was Sure Yu or Shangliu Li, both of them were existences on the same level as Swearin Ting and Jiang Lingxiao. However, Sure Yu and Shangliu Li had the assistance of Midnight Immortal King and Heaven Trampler, so 2 pairs of fists were unable to go against 4. Once a battle broke out between their groups, they would absolutely be in a bad situation. Especially because Jiang Lingxiao was clearly aware that she possessed the Tao Calamity Sword, and it was the weakness of the Sovereign Sect's energy of calamity. When all of this was included, it instantly caused them to be in an extremely difficult situation. They really are hard to kill like cockroaches. Swearin Ting grunted coldly, yet there wasn't a sign of worry between his brows. Junior Sister Jiang, there's no need to worry. For the sake of our trip to the God Attainment region this time, the sect master made plans for us for a very long time, so how could it be undone by Sure Yu's group? Then, the Tao Calamity Sword is included within the sect master's plans as well. Jiang Lingxiao was slightly stunned as she looked at Swearin Ting. She suddenly noticed that this senior brother of hers had always been hiding a great deal of things. For example, the technique to set up the 9 Heaven Calamity Tao Annihilation Divine Formation, the Boundless World Mirror, the technique to utilize sacrificial blood and divine artifacts to activate the might of the restrictions within the God Attainment Palace. She was completely unaware of all of this. Of course. Swearin Ting smiled proudly. It's said that if it's in terms of the ability to deduce the secrets of the heavens, then Oracle Mountain is the best amongst the 3 supreme sects. However, in my opinion, since the Oracle Mountain's ancestor, Fuxi, left, only our sovereign sect is worthy of this title. When he spoke up to hear, his gaze inadvertently swept over and noticed Jiang Lingxiao seemed to be slightly displeased, and he instantly came to an understanding and consoled. Junior sister, don't take it to heart. You're aware as well that all if this was arranged by the sect master, so I couldn't reveal it. Jiang Lingxiao shrugged. I understand, senior brother doesn't have to console me. I just want to know what technique senior brother possesses to deal with the Tao Calamity Sword. A wisp of a secretive smile appeared on the corners of Swearin Ting's mouth. Junior sister Jiang, do you remember how the chaotic divine lotus perished during the primeval times? Jiang Lingxiao seemed to have thought of something, and she swiftly raised her head to look at the chaotic sky before she said with shock, Senior brother, you're saying? Swearin Ting nodded with a smile, and then his expression became icy cold once more as he said in a ghastly tone. All the energy of calamity and heavenly tribulation in the 3 dimensions can be utilized by my sovereign sect. Last time, the chaotic divine lotus perished like that. And this time, Sure Yu and the others will definitely perish here as well. He paused for a moment and said slowly, At that time we won't just be able to become gods, we'll even be able to bring the Tao Calamity Sword back to the sect. and it can be considered as killing two birds with one stone. No wonder. So the sect master even gave that thing to you. Zhang Lingxiao had a slightly complicated feeling in her heart. She and Ting were both amongst the 7 elite disciples of the sovereign sect. Ting was ranked at the 2nd position while she was ranked at the 5th position, and there wasn't a really big gap between them. Yet during the operation this time, she'd suddenly noticed that she turned out to be far inferior to Ting in the heart of the sect master. Junior sister, don't think too much about it. The sect master acted in this way to avoid his plans being leaked. After all, even you're aware that if I didn't bring the boundless world mirror along, then it would probably be impossible to conceal any of our plans from the deduction of Nuos Dao Palace. Ting stopped moving, and he turned around to glance at Zhang Lingxiao. Zhang Lingxiao took a deep breath and said with a smile, I understand. After that, she was shocked as she said, Senior brother, why aren't you continuing forward? Ting smiled, and he placed his hands behind his back as he turned around indifferently. He looked down at the limestone path with a ghastly and emotionless expression before he said calmly, There's no need to continue forward. It wouldn't be too late to head to the peak of the altar after we kill them. Zhang Lingxiao turned around and glanced over, and she noticed that Yu and the others were already 3 kilometers away. God Attainment Altar. When they were another 27 kilometers away from the top of the altar, Yu and the others suddenly stopped moving. They looked towards the distance in unison because Ting and Zhang Lingxiao were standing side by side there, and the two of them were looking over here. In an instant, their gazes collided in midair, and it caused a terrifying and pressuring force to disturb the calm in the surroundings as it enveloped this area. This limestone path that led to the altar was extremely broad and ascended step by step, and their groups were 3 kilometers away from each other. If this was the outside world, then this little bit of distance was nothing to immortal kings that had grasped the laws of space. But on the God Attainment Altar, this short distance was like a natural chasm. The reason was that the God Attainment Altar was enveloped by restrictions that were filled with divinity. The pressure from these restrictions caused immortal kings to be unable to fly or teleport, and this obviously showed how terrifying it was. So even though they were in confrontation while standing 3 kilometers away from each other, both groups didn't take the initiative to attack. In other words, once they entered into battle, they wouldn't just have to fight each other. They would even have to resist the energy of the restrictions that filled the surroundings. Such circumstances would greatly restrain their combat strengths. At this moment, Shi had stopped as well. His gaze didn't move towards Ting and Zhang Lingxiao, and it looked even further into the distance instead. It passed through the peak of the altar and stared towards the space above the chaotic sky. An aura that caused him to feel extreme rage and detest was hidden there, and it caused him to be on the verge of being unable to restrain the vicious feelings in his heart. However, it just so happened that his eyes were icy cold and indifferent. The reason was that even though those feelings of rage, detest, and ruthlessness filled Shi's entire body, it didn't belong to him and had come from the river diagram fragments instead. Amidst the confrontational atmosphere, Yu, Dian, Shangliu Li, and Heaven Trampler moved forward to protect Shi behind them, and then they stood in confrontation with Ting and Zhang Lingxiao from afar. All of their expressions were indifferent and calm. However, the terrifying vital energy that belonged to immortal kings was being circulated to the limit within all their bodies, and they emanated various divine auras that illuminated the surroundings. At that time, a myriad of rifts appeared in space while all sorts of terrifying scenes appeared. Space fluctuated while time was thrown into chaos, and the sounds of ghosts wailing, thunderclaps, and the grand Tao rumbling resounded. It was an extremely shocking scene. Moreover, this was still under the situation that they were being suppressed by the restrictions in the surroundings, and it greatly suppressed their might. If it was in the outside world, then merely the divine might emanated from this terrifying confrontation was capable of destroying the surroundings. This was the might of immortal kings. It was supreme and boundless. They stood at the peak of the 3 dimensions like overlords that controlled the world, and the slightest circulation of their vital energy caused the wails of doom to resound while the grand Tao collapsed. I never expected that all of you would actually be able to come all the way here. All of you can be considered to be not bad. Suddenly, Swearin Ting spoke. His crimson hair fluttered with divine flames enveloped his body, and his peerlessly handsome face was covered in a murderous and ghastly expression that was extremely oppressive. As he spoke, a black jade pagoda silently floated up into appearance on his left palm, while his right hand held a bronze ancient mirror instead. The mirror was around the size of his palm, and it emanated a horrifying glow. The Overlord Sage Path Pagoda, the Boundless World Mirror, two heaven-shaking divine artifacts from the Sovereign Sect. At the same time, Jiang Lingxiao that stood by his side combed the hair by the side of her ear before smiling lightly. A dark yellow whip coiled around her fair and slender fingers, and it was over a meter long and densely covered with countless mysterious and profound symbols. As soon as it appeared in midair, it was suffused with a terrifying aura of judgment, murder, and mercilessness. It seemed like the energy of the heavenly tribulation was grasped in her hand, causing the souls of others to tremble as if they'd been reduced to prisoners that were about to suffer punishment. The whip of heavenly tribulation. This whip was also called the God-beating whip. It was capable of utilizing the energy of the heavenly tribulation, and it was a renowned divine artifact of the Sovereign Sect that had been passed down since the primeval times. I never expected that both of you would actually still have the balls to wait here for us. Shiryu laughed coldly while the space within his brows was filled with a cold and proud expression. He'd really never expected that Swearin Ting and Jiang Lingxiao would actually have the courage to wait here under such circumstances. Moreover, Swearin Ting and Jiang Lingxiao seemed as if they wanted to determine a victor between their two groups in this battle. After all, there were 4 immortal kings in Shiryu's group. No matter if it was Shiryu himself or Xianxia, both of them were confident on fighting Swearin Ting and Jiang Lingxiao evenly by themselves in a one-on-one battle. If Midnight Immortal King and Heaven Trampler were added, then so long as this battle began, they were absolutely confident in being able to defeat Swearin Ting and Jiang Lingxiao. So when they saw Swearin Ting and Jiang Lingxiao actually didn't make the best use of their time to ascend to the peak of the altar and were instead waiting here with the desire to carry out a final showdown with them, Shiryu and the others felt that Swearin Ting and Jiang Lingxiao were obviously unable to maintain their calm. As he spoke, Shiryu had withdrawn the God Mystery Sword and 5-color rock. Xianxia had withdrawn the 9-clarity Jade Crown. Dian had withdrawn the Emperor Divine Battle Axe, and Heaven Trampler had withdrawn the Dark and Enormous Axe. In an instant, various treasures emanated dazzling divine radiance and terrifying auras, and it was a rather magnificent and gorgeous scene. Sometimes, unexpected events are equivalent to death. Just like this moment. Swearin Ting spoke indifferently while the flames around him glowed brilliantly and surged into the sky. He seemed like a god of fire, and as his eyes blinked, his gaze locked onto Shiryu and the others like fiery red lightning before he shouted in a deep voice. "Cut the crap. Do you dare come over to fight me? Do you dare come over to fight me? Come over to fight me. Fight me." Echoes surged through the surroundings. "Ha ha ha. Why not?" Shiryu howled. His voice shook the sky, and he resisted the pressure from the restrictions as he walked forward with large strides. Clang! The God Mystery Sword tore through the sky as he pointed it at Swearin Ting from afar, and then an extremely terrifying strand of sword chi erupted from it. The sword chi actually forcefully tore open the layer upon layer of restrictions as it slashed down towards Swearin Ting. The battle instantly erupted. OM! A grand howl resounded as Swearin Ting shattered the space in the surroundings with the Overlord Sage Path Pagoda in hand. He himself surged with monstrous flames that dispersed the restrictions in the surroundings. When looked at from afar, the pagoda emanated jet black light while he himself emanated terrifying flames, and it was like the scene of an eternal furnace of chaos emanating its vital essence. Rumble! The sword chi and flaming pagoda collided, causing Immortal King laws to rumble and burn, and the heavens and the earth quaked. Fortunately, the God Attainment Altar stood here for eternity because if it was any other place, then it would have shattered into nothingness long ago. Humph! Shiryu's tall figure strode forward like the arrival of a king, and he continued to approach Swearin Ting. In his hand, The god mystery sword tore through the sky and emanated a myriad of strands of sword chi. Every single strand of sword chi was like a strand of flowing light that carried the dazzling divine radiance of an immortal king. When looked at from afar, his entire body seemed to be covered in a myriad of dazzling strands of sword chi. The sword chi blazed brilliantly. They were like a group of comets that were moving upwards within the universe, and they were extremely resplendent and blinding. The others could clearly notice the restrictions that suffused the God Attainment Altar were being broken apart by these attacks that carried peerlessly shocking impetuses. Sure, you, as the #1 Dao protecting disciple of Nuwas Dao Palace, is this all you've got? If it's like that, then today will be your funeral. Swearin Ting roared loudly while his crimson hair fluttered, and the aura in his entire body raged violently as he emanated boundless divine radiance of calamity. It faintly seemed as if numerous terrifying and ancient statues were appearing by his side. All of them were dignified and indifferent, and they possessed monstrous auras. They were like a group of gods that were guarding him and suppressing everything in the world. Bang! Swearin Ting held the Overlord Sage Path Pagoda as he formed a supreme divine seal. The seal crushed down, causing the heavens and the earth to collapse while a torrent of calamity surged down, and it seemed like the river in the 9 heavens was pouring down. In an instant, both of them were locked in battle. The sound of their collision shook the 9 heavens, and it caused terrifying natural phenomenon to appear. The restrictions in their surroundings were destroyed and shattered into pieces while countless spatial rifts had split open, causing time and space to fall into chaos as lightning raged in the surroundings. It seemed like the end of the world had arrived. The gods roared furiously, devils and demons howled in sorrow. Blood rained down while divine radiance filled the sky. All of this wasn't real, and it was the terrifying phenomena revealed by the collision of these 2 immortal kings. The terrifying scenes of the battle between supreme experts in the primeval times had reappeared. Bang! At practically the exact same moment, Heaven Trampler waved the dark and enormous axe while he moved according to footwork related to the Big Dipper. He flashed through space while the enormous axe seemed like a moving divine mountain, and it left behind a myriad of afterimages in space as he joined the battle and fought Swearin Ting with Shiryu. Miss Xianxia, let's play as well? On the other side, Zhang Lingxiao shook the god-beating whip, and it crackled through space like a descending heavenly tribulation as it struck down at Xianxia. Woo, 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 as soon as the god-beating whip was utilized, it was like the heavens and the earth were being judged. It revealed the terrifying might of causing the gods and devils to wail and stars to fall as it smashed down with unimaginable divine might. Just what I wanted. Xianxia shook the 9 clarity jade crown, causing 9 clarity divine light to spray through the heavens and the earth like divine rays that shot into the sky. And the divine light that soared up and filled the sky transformed into numerous ancient and obscure phenomena that shot down towards Zhang Lingxiao. Count me in. Midnight Immortal King utilized the Emperor Divine Battle Axe to create a myriad of violet crescent images that carried dazzling sharp glows as they crushed down like the violet chi that came from the east. Rumble. The battle erupted completely. Shiryu and Heaven Trampler were working together to go against Swearin Ting, while Xianxia Li and Midnight Immortal King were fighting for supremacy with Zhang Lingxiao. At that instant, divine might rumbled while the glow of treasures dazzled the eyes. Resplendent light illuminated the entire world to a gorgeous state. The entire heavens and the earth were blurry and enveloped in the terrifying fluctuations of battle, while peerless killing intent seemed to be on the verge of crushing the world into pieces. This sort of terrifying battle was beyond imagination. If it occurred in the outside world, then it would probably cause boundless calamities and cause the entire 3 dimensions to be shaken. Fortunately, this was the God Attainment Altar that was suffused with restrictions, and these restrictions dealt with most of the aftershock from the battles, allowing the God Attainment Altar to avoid being destroyed. Chun Shi stood on the limestone path yet was actually not affected by the battle. On one hand, it was because Dian Dian kept an eye on him during the battle and helped him deal with life-threatening dangers. On the other hand, it was because his entire body was suffused with the obscure aura of the river diagram fragments. It didn't just resist and deal with the pressure from the restrictions, it even caused the aftershock of the battle to be unable to touch him. No one noticed that Xianxia wasn't moved at all by this world-shocking battle between immortal kings, and his handsome face was covered in a calm and indifferent expression. Besides that, his gaze didn't even pay attention to the battle, and it had always been looking towards the distant peak of the altar. However, because the battle was too terrifying, and blazing divine radiance covered the heavens and the earth, it obstructed Xianxia's field of vision, causing him to be unable to observe the scene at the peak of the altar. However, along with a wave of rumbling from the river diagram fragments, a vertical eye silently split open in the space between Xianxia's brows, and it was deep, icy cold, and indifferent. At this instant, his field of vision cleared up once more. It was even to the extent that when the vertical eye between Xianxia's brows swept towards the chaotic sky, an eye practically instantly and silently appeared and looked at Xianxia from afar.